Hey guys, tonight we drift gently into the lamplit courtyards and whispering scroll chambers of Imperial China. Not the battlefields or banquet halls you've probably seen dramatized on screen, but the quiet, forgettable annex tucked behind the Jade Library, just past the kitchen gardens and slightly uphill from the stable where one overly flatulent ox has been known to disrupt sacred readings during eclipse season. You won't be climbing palace walls or dueling with calligraphy brushes. No, tonight, you're simply showing up to work at the Bureau of Astronomy in the middle of the Tang dynasty, where your job is not to entertain or fight or even flirt with passing concubines, though you have tried. It is instead to observe the heavens and try not to fall asleep while deciphering whether the Emperor's hiccups correspond to Mercury retrograde. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it where you are right now? Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive just before sunset, as instructed, though no one ever actually checks the sundial anymore. Too many shadows, too much squinting, and besides, you've learned that showing up at the exact moment the palace rooster crows his second cough is far more accurate. The outer gate swings open with a reluctant creak, like an elderly servant, unsure if you're worth the effort. And you step into the familiar quiet of the observatory compound, where the smell of old bamboo mats, camphor oil, and yesterday's tea leaves seems to linger with a sense of resignation. Your sandals make soft, apologetic sounds against the stone path, as if they too are sorry for dragging you into another long evening of paperwork, star charts, and trying not to yawn in the Emperor's direction. On your right, the garden is already casting long, elegant shadows over the koi pond. A pond which, if the rumors are to be believed, was once blessed by a Taoist monk who claimed to see the constellation of the azure dragon reflected in its waters. Though most people agree, he had just eaten a suspicious number of fermented bean cakes that day. The frogs are beginning their warm-up chorus, the sound somewhere between enthusiastic hiccuping and soggy approval, and you give them a small bow out of habit, since one of them was once declared a reincarnated prince by a passing monk. And until the Bureau receives written proof otherwise, he technically outranks you. You make your way to the main chamber, a low-ceilinged building with wooden beams stained the color of old lacquered cherries, and walls covered in scrolls, ledgers, and one unfortunate ink stain from the year of the falling apricot, which no one is allowed to speak of. The door gives a polite groan as it opens, and the air inside greets you like a musty old librarian uncle. A bit stale, slightly sweet, and always just a little disappointed that you came back. Your desk sits exactly where you left it. Third from the left, beneath the drafty lattice window that the carpenters promised to fix last spring, but haven't touched since. The chair wobbles like a thoughtful goose, and the inkstone has a crack running through it that you've chosen to interpret as a good omen, a scholarly fracture, as you call it, even though it's ruined 3 brushes and once leaked ink onto your lunch. Tonight's first task: review the previous night's stellar entries and correct any numbers you may or may not have invented to make your reports sound more urgent. The Imperial Astrologers, after all, must appear busy, even when the sky is being maddeningly uneventful. You light the lantern beside you, using the flint you keep tied to your belt. Not because it's efficient, but because you've been trying to look more dramatic lately. And nothing says dedicated night scholar like a slow-motion spark. The flame flickers to life, casting faint gold across the parchment scrolls rolled tight in their cubbyholes like sleeping caterpillars. And you begin to unroll last night's chart. Ah, yes, you had noted a possible disturbance near the tail of the White Tiger constellation, which in retrospect may have been a moth fluttering across your vision. But once it's written in cinnabar ink, who's to argue? You correct a date that you transposed in fatigue, realize you used the word auspicious 5 times in one sentence, and then discreetly add a footnote citing elevated solar anxiety as the cause for unclear visibility. No one reads the footnotes anyway, except the eunuchs, and they only read them to mock you. Outside, the wind brushes gently through the pine trees, bringing with it the scent of damp earth, old stone, and the unmistakable aroma of steamed cabbage drifting from the kitchens down the slope. You inhale deeply, letting the scent settle in your lungs like a polite but persistent dinner guest. You should probably eat soon, but tradition demands that you purify your thoughts before observing the stars. What that actually means in practice is different for every astrologer. Some fast, some chant. One notoriously eccentric fellow from the southern branch used to play a bamboo flute at precisely 47 beats per minute while standing on one leg. You, however, settle for rearranging your scrolls into a configuration that resembles a small mountain and whispering a prayer to the North Star under your breath. Not because you believe it listens, but because it helps center your mind in a world where even moonlight can be misinterpreted as a political warning. Historians still argue whether imperial astrologers truly influenced government decisions or merely provided poetic excuses for things already planned. But you've long understood that your real power lies not in prediction, but in the delicate shaping of narrative. You don't read the stars to find truth. You read them to give the illusion that truth has always been watching from above, waiting for someone with good calligraphy to notice. A moth lands on your sleeve, its wings soft as rice paper, and you pause, staring at it. Some believe moths carry ancestral spirits. Others believe they simply like the warmth of lanterns. You, being pragmatic and occasionally hungry, simply blow it off gently and try not to think about how you once mistook one for a fire omen and caused mild panic in the Western Pavilion. The scrolls finished and the ink dried. You prepare to head up the steps to the observation platform. You gather your robe's sleeves with a practiced flick, an act you once thought elegant, until you accidentally smacked a cup of tea into the lap of the Minister of Ceremonial Affairs, and pick up your star chart, compass, and the small wooden box containing your viewing lens, which may or may not have a crack you've been ignoring for 3 years. The climb to the tower is slow, each wooden stair slightly warped by time and weather, creaking like an old man's joints. You pause halfway to catch your breath and to admire the sunset as it fades into that peculiar, dusty violet hue that reminds you of powdered plum skin and cheap poetry. At the top, the city lies below in a quilt of low rooftops and distant lanterns, with occasional bursts of laughter or the metallic clink of distant guards drawing lots for who has to patrol the ghost quarter. Above, the sky stretches out in its cool indifference, stars beginning to prick through the twilight like embroidered pearls on an impossibly large sleeve. You sit, spine a little sore, legs folded beneath you in what your teacher once called the dignified lotus, but what you now think of simply as knees complaining quietly. The stars are slow tonight. No comets, no odd alignments, just the same measured rhythms, the same celestial habits. You trace your finger over the lines on your chart, noting nothing unusual, and try not to fall asleep as the breeze brushes your cheek and the scent of night-blooming jasmine mixes with the dusty parchment beneath your hands. You begin the evening's slow and sacred transition from anonymous scholar to official servant of the stars, with a quiet, practiced ritual that no one ever formally taught you, yet one that has become second nature after so many seasons beneath the palace eaves. First, you remove your outer robe, the simple one worn through garden paths and down dusty archive corridors, and fold it neatly upon a wooden stool that wobbles slightly due to a missing wedge. And then you retrieve your ceremonial garments from a low chest that smells faintly of dried orange peel and lacquered cedar. Because for some reason, unknown to even the oldest clerks, it was once stored beside the royal fruit pantry during the year of the wandering goose, and never quite lost the scent. The silk robe is heavier than it looks, embroidered in subdued gold thread, with constellations both real and invented. Though you've often wondered whether the laughing pig of the Southern Fork was simply the embroidery master's attempt at humor. Nevertheless, you shrug into it with the reverence expected of your station, the sleeves trailing like river mist across your desk as you reach for the jade clasp that secures it at the neck, chipped slightly at the edge from a previous astrologer's midnight stumble down the observatory stairs during an unfortunate bout of sleepwalking, or, as he later claimed in writing, unexpected lunar influence. Once properly dressed, you step back and look over last month's celestial records, scrolls stacked like shy turtles across your workspace, each one marked with wax seals you have perfected, pressing with the tiny brass dragon stamp passed down from astrologer to astrologer, each curve worn smoother than it should be from years of anxious thumbing during moments when predictions felt less certain and omens more ambiguous. You select 3 scrolls from the pile, one detailing solar transits, another tracking the phases of the moon, and a third marked simply with the character for curious, which usually means something someone forgot to finish, misread, or spilled vinegar on. Unrolling the solar chart, you scan the neatly brushed columns of dates, declinations, and remarks, most of them in your own hand, and some in your apprentice's, whose brushstrokes lean just slightly to the left, like someone bracing against a stiff wind. You note the recorded fluctuation near the summer solstice, the angle of the sun's ascension skewed ever so slightly from last year's average. And you wonder for a moment whether this is evidence of an imminent agricultural shift, a portent of rebellion, or simply the result of a measuring stick that warped under the July heat. You could investigate further, of course, but then you'd have to explain the discrepancy to the Ministry of Harmonious Planning, and that would involve forms, very long forms, and a visit to their administrative wing, which smells perpetually of boiled bamboo and has a guard with an unnerving habit of blinking out of sync. So instead, you quietly pencil in a modest annotation. Solar inconsistency noted. Likely minor atmospheric deviation, which, in official terms, means something seemed off, but not enough to ruin anyone's breakfast. Your fingers drift next to the lunar chart, and you pause a moment, fingers grazing the ink as if the moon herself might hum beneath your touch. The phases are tidy, the waxing and waning well-tracked, and your notations surprisingly poetic. Pale crescent, like a forgotten smile. You remember writing that after a sleepless night, during which the moon hung low over the palace, like a gossiping servant, peeking through the cypress trees, as if trying to overhear imperial secrets. Historians still argue whether astrologers of your rank ever infused personal emotion into their official records, or whether such sentiments were frowned upon by the bureaucratic codes of the time. But you've always known that behind every official seal lies a human hand, and behind every chart, a beating heart, quietly wondering whether the stars above truly cared what the people below did with their days. As you roll up the scroll, careful not to smudge the last character, replete, you hear a rustle at the paper screen to your left. You glance over to see your apprentice, John, peeking through the doorway with a bowl of plums and that look on his face that says, "I forgot something important, but I'm trying to distract you with food." You sigh, motion him inside, and accept the bowl. The plums are overripe, their skins wrinkled like old advisors, but sweet, and the juice drips down your wrist as you take a bite and try to remember whether John was supposed to copy a manuscript, polish the brass pointers, or deliver a message to the incense supplier about the fact that your current batch smells more like cabbage than clouds. As Jun begins to mumble an explanation involving a cat, 2 missing coins, and a monk who might not have been a real monk, you wave him off and return to your charts, already anticipating the quiet solitude of your next task. The stargazing itself, which, for all the preparation and scroll work and ceremonial dressing, remains a surprisingly simple affair. You climb to the rooftop with your instruments, arrange your notes beneath a paperweight shaped like a sleeping fox, and lean forward against the railing. The city below reduced to scattered dots of torchlight, like a fallen constellation unsure how to rise. You've always preferred this moment of stillness, the hush between official duties and quiet observation, when you can feel the pulse of the heavens without the noise of imperial interpretation, when the stars are simply stars, not symbols, not warnings, not excuses for policy changes or grain tax reforms, but just distant fires blazing in the dark, whispering stories no one fully understands. You breathe deeply, the air crisp now, touched with the faint smoke of distant cooking fires and the sharp tang of rain that hasn't yet fallen. The robe's sleeves fall across your lap as you begin sketching the current arrangement of the heavens onto fresh parchment, eyes narrowing as you trace the outline of the Northern Dipper. Always so obliging, always where you expect it to be. Unlike Venus, who tends to flirt with the horizon and disappear just when you need to measure her exact incline. Tonight she's hiding behind a wisp of cloud, like a courtesan playing coy behind a silk fan. And you smile at her stubbornness before adjusting your lens slightly to catch her gleam. Your notes for this month's constellation summary are filled with metaphors. The ox star tugs at the river of firelight, and the archer rests his bow against a pillow of dark sky. A habit you've developed partly out of boredom, partly out of mischief, and partly because the emperor's favorite concubine insists that poetic readings bring her better dreams. You once tried submitting a strictly technical report without a single flower of language, and the next day, your supper was mysteriously delayed by 3 hours and arrived cold. You're halfway through noting the movements of the southern gate stars when a gust of wind flutters your scroll, and you reach out instinctively, pinning it down with your elbow, smudging a line that you'll later blame on Jun's clumsiness. With a quiet sigh, you unroll a clean section and begin again, letting the rhythm of brush and ink guide your thoughts into the familiar calm that always accompanies this work. The sky may shift, the court may change, but the stars remain, blinking down like old acquaintances who've seen too much and forgotten even more. The palace bell chimes faintly from below, signaling the change of watch, and you glance up, surprised at how quickly time has passed. The moon, now well above the horizon, its light casting soft silver patterns across the tiled floor like silk unraveling in water. You gather your scrolls, adjust your robe, and prepare to descend, careful not to step on the one loose tile that once nearly sent your predecessor tumbling into the koi pond with a basket of gongs. A story that still circulates among the servants as a warning against rushing the heavens. At the bottom of the stairs, John is asleep on a pile of blankets, a half-eaten plum clutched in his hand, and you step over him with practiced ease, placing your finished notes on the desk and lighting another lamp. You still have much to do. Planetary comparisons, rice paper drying, and a perplexing dream report involving 3 geese, a thunderclap, and someone named Big Auntie Cloud. But for now, you allow yourself one quiet moment of satisfaction. Robe warm around your shoulders, ink still wet on your hands, and the stars above steady in their places, waiting patiently for your next small interpretation. The quiet rhythm of your duties, soothing in their predictability and surprisingly physical, despite the scholarly image they conjure, continues as you return to your desk, your silk robe trailing slightly behind you like a sleepy dragon unsure whether to curl up or pounce, and you settle into the creaking chair that always complains under your weight, in the same tone as an elderly bureaucrat, muttering about misfiled census records, which, as it happens, it likely was in a previous life. If you believe what the old Taoist at the paper shop says between mouthfuls of pickled radish and unsolicited philosophical advice, before you begin translating the sky's latest whisperings into carefully composed reports. You unroll a sheet of pale mulberry paper, the surface smooth and faintly textured, like the skin of a fruit, just before it bruises, and prepare your brush. Its bristles soft but firm, having been soaked earlier in the tea left over from yesterday morning's ceremonial cup. Because fresh ink deserves a hint of bitterness to make it flow with proper gravitas. Or at least, that's what Master Yin always insisted, before he retired to the countryside to talk to goats and ponder eclipses full-time. The act of writing, of transforming starry patterns into court-approved interpretations, demands not only precision, but also artistry. For every stroke must not only record, but persuade, not only observe but suggest. And as your hand moves slowly across the page, your brush dancing between the rigid and the fluid, like a cautious poet with a fear of editors, you find yourself composing not a report, but a kind of celestial fable, one in which Saturn's lateness to a conjunction meeting is interpreted as a sign that an ambassador from the western provinces will arrive bearing gifts, or possibly goats, depending on how one reads the smudged character beside the longitude entry. And here, in this moment between stars and sentences, you catch yourself humming. Not any particular tune, just the rising and falling of notes that mimic the rhythm of your breath and the distant drone of the wind against the lacquered roof tiles. And it feels like something ancient, like a lullaby, first sung when the sky was still deciding how many stars to hang, long before emperors had concubines or ministers or tax collectors. And long before you, of course, had deadlines. John stirs again, still curled on his mat like a cat that's just barely pretending not to be awake. And you decide to leave him undisturbed for now. Partly out of mercy and partly because you know he'll only ask questions you're not in the mood to answer. Such as why Venus sometimes appears before dusk, even though all the charts say she shouldn't, or why a chicken bone left outside the window is considered bad luck for Mars, or why your charts include doodles of turtles wearing hats on days when the moon is full, and your patience is not. You stretch slowly, vertebrae crackling in reluctant sequence, and retrieve a second scroll from your notes file. This one older, its corners curled from humidity, its string tie frayed like the hem of a storyteller's sleeve. And unfurl it across the desk, revealing a star map from the time of Emperor Taizong, lovingly hand-inked by someone who clearly had too much free time, and an unholy affection for decorative borders involving cranes, clouds, and the occasional inexplicable frog in a hat. You trace the lines with your finger, not to verify positions, they're wildly outdated, but for the sheer pleasure of admiring how someone once thought it important to draw Saturn with what appears to be a feather boa. Historians still argue whether these maps were meant more for decoration than navigation, whether the imperial court truly relied on them for agricultural timing, or merely used them to impress visiting dignitaries with their cosmic sophistication. But you believe, quietly and without pressing the issue, that these star charts were both and neither. Part truth, part performance, part security blanket for a nervous empire looking skyward for permission to exhale. Outside, the night deepens into that rare shade of blue that defies pigment and vocabulary alike. The kind of blue that swallows candlelight without apology, and makes even the most confident lanterns flicker in second-guessing. The stars, now fully awake, gleam with casual indifference, as if amused by your attempts to categorize their moods. And a gust of wind rattles the loose shutter near the door, prompting you to weigh it down with a copy of The Collected Omens of the Northern Provinces, which is thick, underread, and, according to court rumor, once deflected a thrown peach during a disagreement over horoscope rankings at a royal banquet. You resume writing, scroll half filled, and add a note about the slight aberration in Mars's projected arc. Not significant enough to warrant alarm, but perhaps enough to justify the delay in repairs to the Southern Canal, should the governor there be looking for a suitably mysterious excuse. You take a sip of now cold tea, grimace slightly, and consider warming it, but decide instead to chew on a preserved ginger root, kept in a small box beside your inkstone for precisely this purpose. It burns just enough to wake your tongue, clear your thoughts, and make you forget, for a moment, that you're expected to file 5 more scrolls before dawn. The gong outside strikes once, soft and low, signaling the hour of the ox, and you glance toward the eastern sky, where the moon hangs fat and slightly smug, reflecting off the bronze mirror you keep near the window for lunar calculations and, occasionally, for checking whether your eyebrows are still symmetrical. They usually are, but you check anyway, because superstition, like astronomy, demands ritual. You pick up the next brush, thinner, meant for detail work, and begin annotating the margins of your map with tiny characters that dance like ants across the parchment, precise and fussy and utterly unreadable to anyone but you. These marginalia serve no official purpose and are not part of your reports, but they're your secret dialogue with the heavens, your running commentary on the stars' performance, and perhaps your way of whispering back to the cosmos in a language too small for emperors. A knock at the outer door breaks the stillness. Not loud, not urgent, just enough to tell you someone is there who does not wish to disturb, but must. And you rise slowly, joints sighing, robe trailing like a tired thought, and slide open the panel to reveal a courier, young and apologetic, bearing a sealed message scroll with the plum blossom crest of the palace's Dream Interpretation Division. You nod, accept it, offer the boy a candied bean, which he refuses, they always do, and return to your desk with the scroll unopened. You'll read it soon. Perhaps it contains another sleep report from the Emperor, whose dreams have lately involved cranes turning into ministers and teacups whispering state secrets. But first, you turn back to the sky, stepping out onto the wooden platform once more. Ink drying on your fingers and the scent of old ginger still lingering in your nose. The stars, unchanged, blink slowly down at you, and you whisper a quiet greeting, because you are, if nothing else, a creature of habit, and they, after all, have traveled so far just to be seen. The palace at night is not as silent as most would think, for silence itself seems too daring a thing in the presence of emperors, even when they're asleep. The corridors hum softly with the sweeping of brooms, the murmured footsteps of eunuchs walking in pairs, the occasional hiss of steam rising from kitchen vats preparing the next day's broth. And now and then, the click of bamboo tiles from a clandestine game of mahjong being played somewhere far too close to the Imperial archives for anyone's comfort. But up here, on the astrologer's terrace, tucked along the western edge of the observatory court, the sounds are muffled, reduced to a sort of whispered texture against the thicker silence of the stars, and you relish that gentle distance from the rustle of human affairs. Tonight's air is unusually dry, which means you won't have to fuss with the dew sheet or reposition the celestial quadrant every 15 minutes due to fog condensation. So you allow yourself the rare pleasure of simply standing still, eyes scanning the constellations like a bored librarian, pretending not to enjoy a particularly scandalous scroll. There is something strangely reassuring about the way the stars hold their places. Not precisely, of course. They're always shifting, creeping minute by minute across the dark, like shy performers sliding into cue. But they do so with a rhythm that speaks of old agreements, ancient compacts signed in the ink of hydrogen and silence, and you trust them, at least more than you trust the Chancellor of Agriculture, who once insisted a comet had spoiled his melon crop. You return to your workbench and unroll a small parchment circle inked with symbols denoting wind, tide, and emotional turbulence, the latter being a semi-official addition that your predecessor swore by, and that you have come to appreciate after several near-diplomatic incidents involving dreams of upside-down dragons and anxious parrots. Tonight, the indicators suggest mild instability. Nothing dramatic, but enough to justify a slightly elevated incense offering, which you mark in the records with a flourish, trying not to smile at the absurdity of treating celestial gossip like weather reports as you prepare the next chart, brushing a layer of powdered mica onto the compass housing for better visibility under starlight. Your thoughts drift, gently, like a paper lantern carried by wind, toward the question of whether the stars truly influence human behavior, or whether people, endlessly inventive and ever eager for cosmic justification, simply see what they need to see in the patterns above. Historians still argue whether the astrologers of your era genuinely believed in astral determinism or merely performed belief as part of their imperial function. But you've always thought the truth lay somewhere in the middle, a mixture of awe and necessity, poetry and paperwork, reverence tinted with just enough doubt to make the job interesting. You recall, not without fondness, the infamous silken lizard incident, when a courtier's dream of a talking gecko triggered a week-long investigation into whether Mercury had offended the House of Liu. The official verdict, minor misalignment with the House of Fire, led to 3 extra incense ceremonies and a palace-wide ban on lizard motifs for the remainder of the season, including one poor artisan being forced to repaint an entire screen depicting the 8 immortals simply because one of them happened to be standing near a wall that looked vaguely reptilian. This is the sort of thing you don't write down in the official logs, of course. But you do pass them along to June as cautionary tales wrapped in sarcasm, part of his informal training, which also includes lessons such as never mention Saturn during a wedding proposal and always double-check eclipse calculations before speaking in front of generals. He's learning slowly. And though his night vision is abysmal, and his memory for lunar declinations borderline tragic, he shows a quiet curiosity you find comforting, like discovering a single bean sprout growing in a forgotten corner of the temple garden. You finish annotating the alignment of the 5 planets for the coming solstice, noting that Venus and Jupiter are due to pass within what you generously call a flirt's breadth of each other. A phenomenon that, depending on your audience, could signal either harmonious diplomacy or a disastrous marriage. And you pause, brush hovering above the paper, wondering which interpretation the Emperor will prefer. He's been in a philosophical mood lately, ever since the dream about the turtle reading poetry. And you suspect he might welcome a narrative of cosmic harmony, even if it means stretching your poetic license like rice dough on dumpling day. With that in mind, you pen a sentence so delicately hedged that it could pass for a hedge itself. The conjunction of Venus and Jupiter may indicate a period wherein soft influences, if aligned with generous spirits, could yield prosperous understandings. Which is to say, things might go well unless they don't. And if they don't, at least you predicted the potential for misunderstanding in advance. A breeze picks up again, carrying with it the faintest whiff of lotus paste from the kitchens. And you smile because the imperial cooks always prepare their mooncakes a month ahead of schedule, citing ritual alignment, though you suspect it has more to do with hoarding the better sugar rations before the Ministry of Rites notices. It's the kind of minor conspiracy that makes palace life bearable. The quiet defiance of schedules in favor of sweetness. You place the completed chart on the drying rack, weighing it with a smooth stone carved into the shape of a lion yawning. A gift from a visiting astrologer from the southern provinces, who claimed it brought tidal clarity, whatever that means. And you reach for the dream scroll delivered earlier, its seal now cool beneath your fingers. Breaking it with care, you unroll the thick parchment and scan its contents, which predictably concern another imperial vision. This time, a grove of bamboo turning to smoke, a laughing child with no face, and a golden fish leaping into a flame. You read it twice, eyebrows twitching, and murmur aloud, "Tuesday again?" Dreams always intensify on Tuesdays, for reasons no one understands, though some blame the midweek wine deliveries, and others the fact that the court calendar once skipped a Tuesday entirely during a calendar reform in the reign of Emperor Wu, causing what some called residual confusion in the dream realm, and what others called an excuse to sleep through meetings. You set the scroll aside for later interpretation and pick up your small, lacquered box of planetary tokens. Tiny carved representations of the heavenly bodies used in the casting of stars. A practice long since abandoned in official doctrine, but still useful for helping you think through complex alignments. You lay them out on the felt mat. Mars, shaped like a swordfish. Saturn, an old man holding a jar. Mercury, of course, a monkey. You arrange them according to current positions and stare at the pattern, waiting for the click of intuitive understanding that sometimes arrives like thunder, and other times tiptoes in like a reluctant cat. Tonight it offers only a shrug, and you accept that, because not every arrangement bears fruit, and not every night grants revelation. Sometimes the stars are just stars. Sometimes the universe simply wants to be looked at without being deciphered, like a painting whose meaning was forgotten by the artist long before the brush ever touched canvas. You gather the tokens, return them to their box, and press your palms against the table's edge, grounding yourself, feeling the weight of the sky balanced atop your own quiet breath. There is more work to do, always more. But for now, you allow yourself to exhale, long and slow, as if releasing a secret back into the night. Behind you, Jun begins to snore softly, and you let it be. He will wake soon enough, and when he does, you'll show him the map, the fish dream, and maybe even let him hold the monkey token if he promises not to drop it again. The stars remain where they are. The moon tilts slightly, as if listening in, and the night, your old companion, hums quietly on, content in its vast, unknowable calm, with the moon now inching toward its highest perch, casting a pale, indifferent glow across the slate roofs of the inner court. You find yourself moving once again. Not out of urgency, for urgency is as unwelcome in your line of work as a sneeze during a tea ceremony, but out of ritual necessity. That quiet, gravitational pull of duty that tugs at your ankles every time the heavens shift their posture, ever so slightly. You step across the polished tiles of the observatory floor, each footfall echoing softly like a drum, reluctant to wake its own sound, and reach the low stone shelf where the armillary sphere rests, its interlocking brass rings catching the moonlight like loops of molten silk frozen mid-ripple, its shadows crawling gently like tame spiders over the worn measuring marks etched by your predecessors and ignored by most visitors. There is comfort in recalibration, in adjusting the sphere's axis to match the celestial angle now revealed by the sky's evolving script. And though the process is largely ceremonial, meant more to satisfy the court's preference for visible expertise than to produce results unachievable by mental calculation. You take your time, rotating each ring with the careful precision of someone threading thoughts instead of gears, aligning one symbolic orbit after another until the whole contraption seems to sigh into correctness, as though it too has been waiting all evening for this precise moment of mutual agreement with the stars. Jun, now drowsily upright and clearly regretting his decision to awaken, appears beside you like a reluctant shadow in borrowed slippers, rubbing sleep from his eyes and squinting at the sphere with an expression that suggests either deep interest or indigestion, and perhaps, at this hour, both. You gesture to the eastern quadrant and murmur something about the minor declination shift in the lunar mansion of the heart, a term which sounds romantic, but in practice refers to a collection of stars, best known for being vaguely heart-shaped, if one squints sideways and is unusually generous with metaphors. Jun nods with appropriate solemnity, though you notice he writes Star Tummy in his notes, which, to be fair, is not entirely inaccurate, as he scrawls with uneven strokes onto his bamboo slips. You find your mind wandering, gently, lazily, toward the stories woven through the constellations themselves. Those mythic narratives stitched into the sky, not by imperial decree, but by the quiet persistence of generations who found comfort in assigning meaning to flickers of light, who saw in the constellations not scientific data, but dramas. Jealous siblings turned to fireflies, lovers transformed into twin stars, forever chasing each other around the celestial pole. Dragons curled in slumber above the north, their breath the mist of dawn. It is said, though no record confirms it, that the very first Imperial Astrologer was once a shepherd who mistook Venus for the eye of a divine cow. And though historians still argue whether this tale is symbolic or simply silly, you like to believe it's both. Because why not? You look to the northern sky, scanning for the Big Dipper, referred to here as the ladle of heaven, a term that never fails to make you thirsty, and notice how its arc this month curves slightly more steeply than before. A phenomenon you've recorded diligently for years now, and which, while explained in full by the precession of the equinoxes, still feels to you like a secret the sky is slowly unfolding, one ladleful at a time. You mention this aloud, and John asks whether the heavens serve soup or tea, to which you reply, deadpan, that on unfortunate days it's vinegar. And he laughs sleepily, the kind of soft chuckle that breaks no rules and offends no ghosts. Together, you begin logging the positions of the wandering stars, what later centuries will call planets, but which to you remain semi-personified agents of fate, each with its own personality, its own rhythm, its own subtle intentions. Mars is assertive tonight, its red glimmer strong against the indigo sky, like an impatient court official tapping his fan during a long-winded debate. Mercury, as always, is elusive, dancing near the horizon just long enough to be glimpsed before ducking behind a passing cloud, like a gossip who's said too much. Saturn hangs back, deliberate and unimpressed, while Venus glows with that ever-soft shimmer that causes poets to write too much and politicians to pretend they haven't. You record their positions with deliberate care, brush moving across parchment in even, unbroken strokes, a rhythm you've cultivated over years until it resembles breath itself. Inhale, dip the brush. Exhale, draw the line. There's an old superstition among court scholars that miswriting Jupiter's coordinates invites petty arguments for 3 days. And though you've never tested its accuracy, you don't dare risk it tonight. Not with the Grand Secretary already suspicious of your excessive use of poetic terminology in celestial reports. That last complaint still amuses you, especially considering it came from a man who once described his rice harvest as betrayed by clouds, drunk on their own shadow. As the logs fill, you begin preparing the preliminary scroll for transmission. This is not the official document, mind you, but a draft filled with cautious phrasings, potential metaphors, and optional omens, which will later be combed through by an assistant archivist tasked with turning your interpretive flourishes into something palatable for the Minister of Rights. You include a curious observation, a faint doubling of Mercury's path due to atmospheric haze, which could signify miscommunication or perhaps double meanings. You write, those who speak in pairs must listen in threes, which probably means nothing but sounds wise enough that someone will quote it at a meeting before breakfast. And then, because it's nearly the hour of the rat, and the sky's stillness is beginning to thrum with a subtle shift that announces dawn's approach, you light the low censer near your desk, a simple copper bowl gifted to you by a monk who believed scent could guide thought, and feed it a pinch of star anise, dried tangerine peel, and sandalwood, watching as the smoke curls upward like a lazy dragon practicing calligraphy. John sits beside you now, having finished his copywork, his posture more alert than before, but still soft at the edges, as though he hasn't quite re-entered his body yet. And together you sit in silence, sharing a quiet too companionable to be awkward. Outside, the bamboo garden rustles faintly, disturbed by a breeze that arrives without reason and leaves without apology. And somewhere far below in the servants' quarters, a rooster crows too early, embarrassed by his own enthusiasm. You do not mind. The stars are nearly finished speaking for the night, and your role, that of humble translator between heaven and hall, is nearly complete, for now. You stretch again, arms high, joints creaking like aged wood, and allow yourself a small grin. The universe, in all its vastness, still makes time for small rituals, and so do you. You'll send the scrolls in an hour, once the ink has dried and the sun has begun its sleepy rise. But for now, you close your eyes, just for a breath, just for a heartbeat, listening to the stars go quiet, one by one, as if the sky itself were nodding off. The faintest edge of dawn begins to press itself along the far curve of the eastern horizon, like a sleepy brushstroke smudged gently across the underside of the sky. And you, standing now with your elbows resting lightly on the carved railing of the observatory's eastern balcony, are reminded not so much of beginnings, but of continuations. Because truly, in this place, at this height, beneath these constellations, and within these palace routines that repeat with a loyalty most servants only pretend to possess, the line between end and beginning is less of a moment and more of a murmur that loops gently upon itself, over and over, like an old melody hummed out of habit rather than intention. Below you, the roof tiles begin to glow with a kind of hesitant pink, and the gardens you cannot quite see exhale their invisible perfumes. Light citrus from the kumquat trees, earthy mint from the shaded hedges, and a trace of camellia dust rising as dew begins to stretch and shake itself free. The servants will be stirring soon, and not just the silent ones like you who walk in hours before daylight matters. No, soon the real noise will come. Brushes against floorboards, rice being turned, doors sliding open with the kind of decisive sound that only a bureaucrat's sandals can make. You take one final breath of nighttime air before retreating inside, not because your work is done, but because now it must become invisible. The astrologer's greatest talent, after all, is not reading the stars, nor memorizing the endless associations between constellations and crops, between planetary alignments and diplomatic missteps. It is, rather, the subtle art of vanishing just as the empire opens its eyes. You must always arrive before everyone else and leave no footprints behind. Still, the report must be written. The morning scroll, the summary, the guidance requested by the Chamberlain at precisely the same time every third day, despite the fact that you are fairly certain he only reads the parts involving harvest predictions and omens about his pets. You light the oil lamp, now flickering with the unsure energy of flame, trying to outlast the sun, and sit before your writing desk, where a blank scroll stretches across the polished surface like a field of waiting furrows. The brush, long-haired and slightly overused, finds its rhythm quickly, because your hand already remembers what your mind need not rehearse. The format, the phrasing, the subtle caution required when suggesting, without saying directly, that the emperor might want to delay his tiger hunting expedition by a week due to unfavorable astral tides. The phrase is vague enough to satisfy propriety and flexible enough to be correct no matter what happens. Your small insurance policy against both celestial miscalculation and imperial mood swings. Today's report includes a peculiar note: a shifting in the position of a lesser-known star in the southern sky, which by tradition is associated with household accidents and misplaced spoons. Two topics that rarely concern the high ministers, but are of great interest to kitchen staff, and the Empress Dowager's physician, who once claimed a soup ladle lost during an eclipse had triggered his chronic shoulder pain. You add the observation delicately, framing it as a transitional echo, which means absolutely nothing, but which always makes the eunuchs nod with a seriousness that suggests deep philosophical agreement. Historians still argue whether reports like yours actually influenced imperial policy, or whether they simply served as post hoc justification for decisions already made in shadowed corridors by powerful men with sharp fans and sharper ambitions. You suspect the answer, again, lies somewhere in the middle. A blend of real belief, theatrical performance, and that curious human need to see meaning in the patternless. Sometimes your words change nothing. Other times, they stop a war or start one. You've learned not to guess which is which. As you complete the scroll and set it to dry under a curved bone weight carved in the shape of a tortoise, your thoughts wander to the story of Master Ji, an astrologer from 3 dynasties ago, whose prediction of a comet led to the cancellation of a major wedding, and indirectly to the fall of a powerful noble house. His charts still sit in a locked drawer beneath the western cabinet, and once, on a particularly quiet night, you opened them and read his notations. Meticulous, obsessive, and entirely sincere. He saw things in the stars that no one else did, and whether he was mad or gifted remains undecided. You find him oddly comforting. John, having finally brushed his hair into something approximating order, appears with 2 steaming cups of barley tea, a sign that the palace kitchens are awake, and more importantly, that someone remembered you exist. You accept the tea with a grateful nod and sip slowly, letting the slightly bitter taste sharpen the corners of your still-floating thoughts. John glances at the drying scroll and asks if he should begin copying it into the day's ledger, and you answer with a vague sound that could mean yes or maybe, or wait a moment, because in truth, you're not ready to release it just yet. Instead, you pick up another scroll, this one personal, wrapped in pale silk, its seal unbroken for nearly a year. It is your backup sky, a map you draw only when you feel particularly adrift, when the movements of the heavens begin to feel too repetitive, too well-behaved. The last time you updated it was after a minor eclipse went unnoticed due to fog. and you felt the universe had slipped past you with a silent smirk. You unroll the map now, smoothing its surface with the back of your hand, and begin to add a few stars. Not real ones, not yet observed, but imagined, theoretical, speculative. A cluster here that might explain certain fish migrations. A streak there that could account for sudden illnesses in the western provinces. It's all guesswork, fantasy, perhaps even foolishness. But it helps. It reminds you that the sky is not finished yet, that mystery still has room to stretch. You label the cluster Cicada's Voice, after the strange silence you noticed last summer when the insects failed to sing for 3 nights in a row. An event no one else cared about, but which haunted you in a quiet way you never quite explained, even to yourself. Jun leans over your shoulder, squints and says, "That one looks like a dumpling." You laugh, not because he's wrong, but because he's perfectly right, and add a note beside it. Dumpling star foretells mild happiness and full stomachs. The sky may not approve, but you do. The sun now begins its slow unfurling across the paper walls of the chamber, casting long rectangles of soft light that make everything look slightly unreal, like a painting that hasn't dried yet. And you know your time here, this brief bubble of pre-dawn quiet, is nearly over. Soon the halls will fill with demands, requests, appearances, and the slow churn of ceremonial protocol that allows an empire to imagine itself eternal. You roll up the finished scroll, hand it to Jun with the kind of casual authority that makes him feel like a trusted assistant, rather than a boy still learning which end of the telescope to peer into, and rise to your feet, stretching gently as your spine registers its mild disapproval. You watch him carry the report towards the courier post with both hands, as if it might float away otherwise, and you allow yourself a rare moment of pride. Not just in him, but in the whole strange dance of observation, interpretation, and gentle mischief that defines your life. The heavens continue their slow migration above, uncaring, magnificent, and impossibly patient. And you, their unofficial interpreter, their quiet scribe, return to your desk and pour yourself one last cup of barley tea before the bell chimes and the day begins in earnest, knowing that tonight the stars will return, and so will you, ready once more to listen. The morning proceeds, as it often does in this palace of repetition and ritual, not with abrupt declarations or dramatic processions, but with the soft choreography of duty performed in practiced silence. Attendants lifting curtains as if unveiling not just the view, but the entire performance of the imperial day. Scribes already hunched over bamboo slips that will carry rumors as surely as they carry records, and courtiers floating past each other with that odd blend of indifference and curiosity that only years of proximity without intimacy can produce. And as for you, well, you are exactly where no one expects you to be. In the secondary archives, seated cross-legged between shelves that smell faintly of ink, resin, and that particular dryness only time can manufacture. The scroll you're reading now is not part of your required study. It has no immediate bearing on lunar shifts or eclipse forecasts, nor does it contain politically urgent planetary predictions. But something in its title, smudged as it was, intrigued you enough to pry the case open and begin decoding the brushstrokes within. Observations on the whispers of the western sky, as heard by senior scribe Meng during the long silence of the third month. Not exactly required reading, but undeniably your kind of trouble. The document is peculiar, not in what it says, but in how it says it. Part diary, part scientific record, part philosophical musing, by someone who may or may not have believed that the stars themselves could hum songs into the ears of listeners, patient enough to wait for them. Meng speaks of constellations, like guests arriving late to a dinner party, of Venus appearing as a proud sister who always wears the same silk robe to every banquet, and of shadow eclipses as celestial stage fright. There is little hard data, no useful angles, no tables, but a surplus of metaphors, many involving fish, some involving ghosts, and one involving a goose that you're fairly sure is a joke you don't yet understand. Still, as the dust motes drift lazily in the slanted sunlight and your tea cools beside you with the determined silence of neglected refreshments, you find yourself nodding along. Not because you agree with everything, but because you recognize the tone. That soft desperation to find poetry in precision, to believe that your nightly calculations are more than cold logic, that your labor is not simply tolerated by the court, but somehow matters, even if only to the stars themselves. Historians still argue whether astrologers in your era were genuine scientists or elegant pretenders, court actors whose tools and charts served less as instruments of truth than as mirrors for power to admire itself within. But as you read Meng's ramblings, you suspect the answer is neither. Perhaps you're more like gardeners, tending to patterns you did not invent, pruning and interpreting and feeding the roots of systems far older than any emperor's reign. And in that care lies a strange, quiet kind of integrity. Your reverie is broken not by a summons, but by June. Of course, June, who appears in the doorway with the unmistakable expression of someone who has seen something strange and isn't sure whether it's wonderful or worrying. He carries a bamboo slip clutched tightly in one hand and waves it before you with the urgency of someone who has not yet learned the value of stillness. You raise an eyebrow in exaggerated annoyance, but the gesture is more ritual than reproach. "Master," he says, catching his breath, "there's a star where there wasn't one before." You blink slowly. "A new star?" John nods. "Near the constellation of the White Tiger. It blinked 3 times and held steady. I checked the charts. It's not on any of them. Even the old ones you hide behind the cabinet. Now, it would be easy, comforting even, to dismiss this as a trick of the atmosphere. A low-altitude lantern mistaken for celestial motion, or perhaps just the eager eyes of a boy too excited by the idea of discovery. And yet, June is not easily excitable. In fact, the last time he claimed something with this much certainty was during an eclipse, when he insisted the moon looked like a biscuit someone had already taken a bite out of, which, while not technically precise, turned out to be a better public explanation than the official report. You follow him back to the observatory, passing servants who glance at you with thinly veiled curiosity, because no one moves quickly at this hour unless something's wrong or unusually right, and take up the telescope once more, adjusting its angle slowly, tenderly, as though you're coaxing a confession from an old friend who's grown reluctant to speak. And then you see it. A point of light, sharp and distinct. Not twinkling like most stars, but steady, brazen even, as if it has always been there and is merely surprised that you're only now noticing it. You hold your breath. Comets move, planets glow differently, lanterns flicker. But this is new. Not imagined, not mislabeled. A quiet defiance nestled between familiar stars. You begin the notation process immediately, charting its exact location relative to nearby constellations, drawing the approximate distance using the curved grid etched onto your observation slate, and calculating the lunar angle for further triangulation. Jun watches you with a mixture of pride and apprehension, clearly thrilled that his discovery is being validated, but also beginning to suspect that new stars come with new problems. You pause and say, half joking, well, if it explodes tomorrow, at least we'll have documentation. He doesn't laugh. The report you draft is careful, unassuming. You refer to the star as unconfirmed observation near western claw of White Tiger sector, and you add the expected disclaimers about atmospheric interference and optical illusions. But you also include a footnote, one that only the Minister of Astronomy will read. Previous astrologers spoke of sky blooms, brief celestial lights appearing at moments of dynastic tension. This is likely unrelated. Probably, Jun watches you seal the scroll and finally dares to ask the question you've been avoiding. Is it a bad sign? You shrug. It's a sign. Bad or good depends on what the Emperor wants it to mean. And there lies the real art of your profession. Not the discovery, not the documentation, but the delivery. For in truth, it is not the stars that change the empire, but the interpretation of their moods, delivered with enough confidence to sway those who wield power, but not so much certainty as to implicate you if events take an unfortunate turn. You return to your desk and begin cross-referencing the observation with older records. There are whispers of similar events, flashes of unexplained light, catalogued in the dusty margins of Song Dynasty charts. A curious note about a wandering flame seen in the eastern sky during the reign of Emperor Liang, and a dubious poem suggesting that when stars bloom unasked, kings should consult their dreams. You add this last line to your private journal, not because it helps, but because it sounds nice. And you have always preferred elegant nonsense to blunt analysis. Outside, the sun is now fully risen, indifferent to your new discovery, and the palace resumes its familiar rhythm. Clatter of trays, rustle of silk, polite murmurs disguising ambition. But for you, everything has shifted slightly. A star has appeared where none was before. And whether it's a birth, a warning, or simply an accident of time, you know one thing for certain. Tonight, you will look again, because the sky may be vast and mostly silent, but occasionally it whispers, and you are one of the few who still knows how to listen. You've heard it said before, mostly from senior ministers or overconfident military men with too much beard and not enough patience. The true power lies in action, in decisive moments of war or decree or marriage, in the slamming of palace doors, and the ink-dark sweep of imperial signatures across edicts made of bamboo and fear. But as you sit now in the garden pavilion, usually reserved for dignitaries who never arrive on time, surrounded by the scent of damp moss, quiet stone, and the distant gossip of cranes pretending to be dignified, you are once again reminded that the real machinery of empire is slower, quieter, and infinitely more boring than even its own scholars dare admit. The emperor, it turns out, has heard of the new star. Not directly, of course. He doesn't read your reports unless they're summarized in 4 words by a eunuch with excellent handwriting. But somehow the news, like a windless smell or an oddly timed bird call, has made its way from telescope to throne, distorted along the path by layers of protocol and personality, until what was once an unconfirmed flicker of celestial irregularity is now being whispered about as an omen of shifting fortunes. Or worse, the star of the rooster's regret, which isn't even a real constellation, but was popularized in a satirical opera that's been banned for at least 3 dynasties, which naturally only made everyone remember it. You're summoned to the lower eastern courtyard, not the main hall, not the inner sanctum, just a nice, respectable halfway place, which usually means someone is hedging their bets. And as you arrive, clutching a freshly copied version of your report, this time with no poetic flourishes, just straight angles and numbers, you're greeted by none other than Minister Han, who wears the expression of a man who has just eaten something mildly unpleasant, but intends to keep chewing until protocol gives him permission to stop. Master Astrologer, he says, with a half bow that includes just enough neck to show respect without surrender. You are aware, of course, that His Majesty values the continuity of the stars. You resist the urge to say, "So do I," and instead nod slowly, diplomatically, neutrally. Han gestures toward a stone bench, and you both sit, not facing each other, but side by side, as if you are 2 strangers on a bridge pretending not to eavesdrop on each other's thoughts. Some among the court, Han continues, his voice dropping slightly, have taken the appearance of this new light as a signal. Of what? No one agrees. Prosperity, famine, a warning, a gift. One gentleman suggested it foretold the return of the imperial goose. He was asked to leave. You breathe in deeply, feeling the damp garden air fill your lungs with the mossy calm of very old stones, and you reply carefully. As is the case with many celestial phenomena, interpretation is often shaped by the lens through which it is viewed. Han closes his eyes briefly, a gesture of either appreciation or exhaustion, perhaps both, and then, in a voice that tries hard not to sound like a command, says, "It would be helpful if the official narrative were clear, modest, reassuring." There it is. Not a bribe, not an order, just the delicate music of request playing between the silences of political caution. And you nod, again slowly, knowing full well what's being asked. Not to lie, but to sculpt the truth into something round and smooth and unlikely to cause ulcers in the imperial stomach. Later, back in your study, you stare at a blank scroll for a long time, longer than necessary, listening to the faint ticking of your sand clock and the even fainter sound of June muttering numbers to himself as he double-checks your calculations. You want to write that the star is insignificant, a passing shimmer, a trick of cloud and angle. But you can't. Not because it would be dishonest, though it would, but because you know it won't help. Silence invites speculation. Mystery breeds fear, and emperors, despite their jade robes and divine titles, are notoriously susceptible to both. So instead, you begin the scroll with the phrase, "The new point of light, observed in the western sector near the white tiger's paw, appears stable and consistent with earlier records of known phenomena described during the reign of Emperor Xuan." Which is true, sort of. Xuan's astrologers did report a similar star, though their records are vague, and the actual existence of that star is still debated by scholars who enjoy arguing over whether ancient paper mold discoloration counts as evidence of a comet. But it's enough. You continue. Its presence does not deviate from the expected order of heaven, and while its novelty has inspired much discussion, current calculations reveal no unusual interference with lunar, solar, or terrestrial rhythms. And finally, in accordance with celestial harmony, its arrival may be interpreted as a symbol of continuity, an echo of heaven's commitment to the present age. There. Not a lie. Not even misleading, really. Just curated. John watches you sign the scroll and asks, "What if it's something else?" You pause. It always is. He blinks, unsure whether that's comforting or terrifying. You seal the scroll and hand it off for delivery. It will be copied, whispered, summarized, and eventually reduced to a single phrase in someone's briefing pouch. By tomorrow, the court will believe it, not because it's compelling, but because it's convenient. And so you find yourself once again wandering through the quiet parts of the palace, the corners with cracked tile, the unused stairwells, the echoing courtyards where laundry dries in secret corners and nothing urgent is allowed to happen. And you realize, with a kind of resigned amusement, that being an Imperial Astrologer means not only watching the stars, but managing their reputations. Historians still argue whether palace astrologers truly believed in what they wrote, or whether they were simply artisans of ambiguity, trained not to read the heavens, but to translate them into whatever shape power required. You, for your part, believe in both. That stars speak, and that politics wears very thick earmuffs. That night, you return to the observatory. You wait until everyone else has gone, until even the servants have extinguished their lamps, and Jun has curled up under his cloak in the corner, pretending not to snore. And you climb the stairs slowly, carrying no scroll, no ink, no brush, only your breath and your eyes, and that stubborn echo of curiosity that refuses to die. And there it is, the star, still shining, still steady, still waiting. You wonder, not for the first time, if it knows you're watching it. And you wonder, also not for the first time, whether you are its witness or its excuse. The following morning arrives not with any great ceremony, nor even with a proper sunrise, just a soft lightness spreading across the compound stones like a sigh that forgot to become a breeze. And you, still dressed in yesterday's robes because, frankly, the sky didn't allow for wardrobe changes, are already seated on the cold floor of your study, surrounded by open scrolls like a drowning man surrounded by poetry, none of which will help him breathe any better, but all of which give him the illusion of thoughtful drowning. Jun stumbles in carrying a tray, far too grand for what it contains. Thin porridge, yesterday's pickled turnips, and a small cup of green tea that seems to judge you silently and says nothing at first. Probably because he knows your mornings, like delicate stars, must be approached sideways. He places the tray beside your elbow and waits for your mood to settle, which in your case means watching you chew slowly while continuing to read a chart so faded it might just be a painting of dust. Finally, Jun speaks, and to his credit, he begins in a soft tone, usually reserved for monks or people who have just broken someone's favorite instrument. "There's a man," he says, "from the Southern Observatory. He's been asking questions. You don't look up immediately. Questions are rarely a good thing, especially when they come from other astrologers. Most of them believe they're playing the same game you are, though some are convinced they're playing it better, which is always dangerous. Questions like what? You ask after swallowing a bite of tepid porridge that you suspect has already begun writing its resignation letter, Jun shifts. He wants to know how we calculated the trajectory of the new star. You nod slowly. "We didn't calculate a trajectory. We logged a position." Jun continues. He says it's moved. That, finally, makes you blink. Stars don't move, at least not like that. Planets wander, comets streak. But stars? They're supposed to sit still and glow like very obedient, very old bureaucrats. You rub your temple, already regretting the day before it's even fully arrived, and mutter, "Tell him I'm available at sunset." Not before. Jun bows slightly and leaves, and you return to the chart before you, suddenly aware that every line on the parchment, every slanted ink mark and half-erased annotation is a guess dressed up as precision, and that somewhere between what you see and what you say lies a gulf wide enough to lose an empire in. By evening, the Southern Astrologer arrives. His name is Lin, and he is precisely the sort of man you distrust on instinct. Well-groomed, calm-eyed, with a tone of voice that suggests he's already sure he's right and is only here to let you arrive at the same conclusion, preferably while complimenting his wisdom. He carries a small case under one arm, lacquered black with mother-of-pearl inlays shaped like foxes, which seems both ostentatious and vaguely threatening. He greets you with the formality of someone who's rehearsed it twice and begins speaking before his feet have even fully crossed the threshold. "You logged the white tiger anomaly as stationary. My instruments disagree." You gesture to the cushion opposite yours. "Then your instruments are either more advanced or more ambitious." Lin does not smile, which, if nothing else, suggests he might have once studied actual astronomy. He opens his case and produces a scroll, unfurling it across the floor with deliberate grace, revealing a series of marks that resemble your own but are subtly, maddeningly different. His drawing shows the star as drifting, just slightly, toward the east, a motion so minor it could be attributed to breathing errors in measurement, except that he's recorded it 3 nights in a row. You stare at it longer than necessary, giving the impression of deep thought, while mostly resisting the urge to sigh dramatically. If it's moving, you say eventually, then it's not a star. Lynn nods. A comet, perhaps, or something new. You don't like the sound of that. Something new is exactly the kind of phrase that gets whispered through corridors and reappears 2 weeks later as a temple fire or a border skirmish. Historians still argue whether court astrologers ever truly cooperated with each other, or whether the appearance of shared data was merely a polite fiction maintained to avoid scandal. You suspect both are true. Lynn is polite, his fiction is elegant. But the problem is not the data, it's what people will do with it. And here, finally, you must decide. Because if the light in the sky is not a fixed star, but a moving body, it becomes a different kind of omen entirely. One of change, of journeys begun and not yet finished, of imperial fates unsettled. Some might read it as the death of something, others as the birth of something worse. And you, with your worn brush and fading patience, must choose whether to write it down in ink or memory. You clear your throat and say, what if we waited 3 more nights? If it moves again, I'll confirm the deviation. If not, it may simply be an atmospheric illusion. Lynn folds his scroll with a precision that borders on passive aggression. 3 nights, then? When he leaves, Jun returns to your side, carrying more tea and a look that's halfway between admiration and panic. Is it true? He asks. You shrug. Depends what we want to believe. That night, you observe again. The sky is clear, as if conspiring in your hesitation, and the star, or not star, is exactly where you left it. Or very nearly. You measure. You remeasure. You ask Jun to measure. He gets a different result. You measure again. The point of light seems to taunt you with its indifference. It's possible that it's moving. It's possible that you're wrong. And it's entirely possible that the stars have decided, after centuries of patience, to begin telling stories no one asked for. Back in your journal, which no one reads but you and possibly a very bored ghost, you write the phrase, "Heaven, like all great authors, prefers ambiguity." You do not sleep that night, not out of fear, but out of a stubborn desire to catch the truth mid-step, to watch it break its own silence before anyone else can misinterpret it. But the sky remains stubborn too. It says nothing, just glows and waits. By the time the second of the 3 promised nights arrives, your study has transformed into something between a shrine and a battlefield. With charts covering every flat surface, inkpots relocated to improbable corners, and John having resorted to writing notes directly on the floor tiles, because, as he explained with an exhausted shrug, they're the only surface you haven't contradicted yet. The truth is, you are not seeking answers. You are seeking consistency, which, as every proper Imperial Astrologer eventually learns, is often the last thing the stars are willing to give. That evening, you ascend the observatory steps with the kind of reluctant determination one usually reserves for diplomatic banquets or funerals, where one might be expected to give a poem. And you arrive at your usual post, just in time to catch the last lazy curve of the sun, slipping behind the palace's tiled eaves, its light brushing the tops of the whispering cypress trees, like a secret too tired to whisper properly. The sky, mercifully, is clear again. A generous act, perhaps, or a trap. and you set to work, measuring the position of the disputed light. It gleams, but it always gleams, mocking you with its stillness. Or maybe its subtle migration, depending on which version of the truth your instruments choose to cooperate with. You mark it again, precisely, then again for redundancy, and then you have John mark it, though by now his handwriting looks like it's been soaked in vinegar and wrung out over a drum. You compare notes. They do not match, not drastically, but just enough to whisper. Just enough to raise doubt, like a curtain you thought had been nailed shut. And here's the worst part. The difference between the readings is not large enough to be explained by motion alone. It might be measurement error, or it might not. It might be the Earth trembling just a fraction on its axis, or your eyes playing tricks, or heaven cracking its knuckles in the dark. Jan looks at you as if you're supposed to interpret it all, as if there were a secret drawer in your skull where divine intention has been filed alphabetically. Well, he asks. You answer, it depends. On what, you don't say? Later that night, as the courtyard dogs begin their mournful singing and the kitchen fires die one by one, you sit back in your wooden chair, its legs worn smooth by decades of hesitant conclusions, and you write a new line in your journal. There are truths too small to see without belief, because this is what it means to be the Imperial Astrologer. Not to predict, not to divine, not even to understand, but to choose between competing uncertainties and pretend that the chosen one is inevitable. By morning, Lynn has returned, early and smug, holding a new scroll, like a man who has just found the last piece of a puzzle and now wishes to gloat in poetic metaphors. You meet him at the outer pavilion, where the wind is cool and smells faintly of ink and dry grass. And you open the scroll together. The new reading does show movement, a tiny arc, eastward again. Faint, but more distinct this time, as if the star, or not star, has decided to test your patience by committing just enough motion to confirm doubt, but not enough to justify action. You close the scroll slowly and say, if it moves again tonight, we will need to declare it. Lynn raises an eyebrow, and if it doesn't, you sigh, then we'll declare it anyway. No one remembers motionless stars. That afternoon, you're summoned to an unexpected audience. Not with the Emperor, thankfully, but with the Chief Recorder of Heavenly Affairs, which is still enough to require ceremonial hair oil and a robe you haven't worn since the last solar eclipse. The Chief Recorder, Master Shu, is a man of minimal emotion and maximal punctuation, known for annotating even casual conversations with footnotes and addenda. He greets you with a slow nod, and after 3 minutes of formalities, speaks. There is concern, he begins, that reports from the Southern Observatory are contradicting yours. You nod. They are. Another pause. Shu blinks like a cat, deciding whether to yawn. And will this contradiction be resolved before the festival of ancestral rice? You blink back. That depends on whether the sky cooperates. He seems unamused. You continue. The discrepancy is minor, but symbolically significant. If it continues, we will need to reclassify the object, possibly as a guest star. She mutters, guest stars are politically inconvenient. You agree silently, because guest stars, in the imperial worldview, are neither guests nor stars. They are invaders, anomalies, messengers without clear origin or etiquette, often interpreted as signs of turbulence or challenge. Previous ones have been associated with invasions, rebellions, or even imperial deaths. Sometimes all three. And yet to ignore it now would be worse. You leave Shu's chambers with the faint suspicion that he's already preparing several alternate interpretations to file, depending on what you report in the coming days. And that one of them probably includes blaming it on the dietary habits of Mongol horses. That evening, the sky remains perfectly cloudless. It feels almost staged. You take your readings again. This time, John insists on drawing the chart himself. And you let him. Because at this point, fresh hands might mean fresh guilt. And there it is again. Movement, real, measurable, eastward, just as before. Lynn's earlier readings are confirmed. The point of light is moving. You sit very still after that, because now you must write the scroll that says so. You must declare to the Empire that something is wandering through the heavens, slow and bright and probably harmless, but certainly unfamiliar. And you must choose whether to describe it as a comet, which implies impermanence, a planet, which invites mythological speculation, or something else entirely. You decide on this. A heavenly guest, luminous in motion, appearing within the domain of the white tiger, has now been observed to progress across the night sky over successive evenings. Though its meaning remains cloaked in celestial discretion, its presence affirms the vitality and attention of heaven to the affairs of men. It is neither fearful nor triumphant. Simply awake. John reads it and nods. Lynn reads it and does not. You send it anyway. And just like that, the Empire begins to tremble. Not in war, not in panic, but in ceremony. Rituals are adjusted. Offerings are made. Dancers rehearse new movements. The royal incense stores are inspected for freshness. Poets write vague verses about wind and distance. Priests polish their bells. And somewhere, probably, a bureaucrat decides that this star means grain taxes should be increased in 2 provinces, just in case. And you return to your observatory. You sit, and you watch, and you wait. Because now, whatever happens next will be history. You wouldn't think that a single speck of light, nudging its way through the void, could cause quite so much embroidery. But by the time 3 more nights have passed, there are imperial tailors stitching fresh constellations onto ceremonial robes, calligraphers preparing scrolls for seasonal reinterpretation, and a troupe of musical scholars arguing over whether the movement of the guest star calls for a subtle shift in the court's tuning system. A debate which, to your eternal non-surprise, will be resolved not by astronomy, but by the personal tastes of the Minister of Harmony, who, as legend has it, once rejected a pentatonic scale simply because the 5th note reminded him of a snub-nosed cousin. The air around the observatory has grown restless, not in the way of wind or weather, but in the quiet footsteps of messengers arriving unannounced, slipping behind doors with sealed documents, and leaving before anyone has had time to brew the tea they pretend they're not thirsty for. You begin to notice that when you descend to the palace archives, heads turn a little too quickly, voices drop a little too fast, and even the old archivist, who usually grunts at your presence, now attempts a bow so deep it nearly causes a spinal catastrophe. You are no longer just a man with ink stains and telescope calluses. You are the witness, the one who saw the guest arrive, the one who might, just might, know what it means. And that, of course, makes you dangerous. Not because of what you know, but because of what people believe you might say. You begin receiving scrolls, carefully worded, cautiously phrased inquiries from mid-ranking nobles, ministers with vague titles, even a few temple custodians asking whether, hypothetically, certain dreams or portents might now be considered more relevant given the celestial motion presently under consideration. One particularly bold monk includes a sketch of a fish with a human face and suggests it might be connected. You make a note to never visit that monastery. John is no help. He finds the attention amusing and has taken to answering your door with an exaggerated flourish, announcing guests in booming tones like His Wobbliness, the deputy interpreter of incense vapors. A title he invented, you're fairly sure, though someone actually bowed to it once. But beneath the jokes and the endless brushing of errant dust from star maps, you sense in him the same unease that has crept into your own bones. Because while a guest star is rare, what follows is always more unpredictable. Sometimes nothing. Sometimes flood or famine. Sometimes, rarely yes, but memorably, a reshuffling of the court, so dramatic it becomes an epic poem or an accidental rebellion. Historians still argue whether such celestial events truly caused policy shifts, or whether they merely coincided with a ruler's pre-existing restlessness. But you've seen enough of both stars and emperors to suspect that causality is less important than timing, and that most changes in history begin not with logic, but with momentum. So you write carefully. Every phrase in your updates is balanced like a porcelain cup on a bamboo reed. Every metaphor chosen to soothe rather than stir. You describe the star's motion as graceful, steady, auspiciously aligned with the season. You invoke the harmonious cycle of earth and heaven. You quote an old poem about peach blossoms blooming early. Not relevant, perhaps, but calming. You even add a line about ducks nesting peacefully along the riverbanks, which is either poetic or deeply confusing, depending on the reader's sleep schedule. And for a moment, it works. The palace calms. The messengers slow. You're left, blessedly, to your instruments and your silence. But silence has a way of echoing, because just when you begin to think the sky has offered all its secrets, it changes again. It happens late one evening during what should have been a routine observation. You are adjusting the angle of the bronze sighting tube when you notice it. Barely perceptible at first, but undeniable once seen. A second light, dim, red, faint as a whisper behind a curtain, but real and moving. You freeze. John, beside you, is chewing on dried plum and doesn't notice until your hand tightens around the edge of the chart, so hard the paper creases, like it's exhaling pain. What is it? He asks. You don't answer immediately, because this complicates everything. One guest star is rare. 2 is legend. 2, in some records, is disaster. There are stories, fragments, really, of twin lights in the sky appearing before dynasties fell, before rivers ran backwards, before emperors dreamed of dragons with 2 heads, and woke up issuing edicts to cut taxes and their own hair. But you're not superstitious. You are trained. You are calm. You're probably lying to yourself. John sees it next, and his plum falls unceremoniously from his mouth onto the wooden floor, which feels like an appropriately tragic offering. He begins. Yes, you say. What does it mean? He asks. You stare into the sky and reply, that tomorrow I write again, and write you do. With the delicacy of a man sketching an earthquake in calligraphy, you compose a report that neither overstates nor obscures, that mentions the second light in the gentlest of terms, describing it as a flicker, a companion to the celestial guest, perhaps a messenger, or perhaps a trick of breath and wind. You are aware, as you write, that every word will be read, not just for meaning, but for omen, that pauses will be measured, that poetry will be parsed, that someone, somewhere, will claim you are hiding something, and they will not be entirely wrong, because you are hiding your fear. The following morning, Lynn arrives again, this time without his lacquer case. He has heard. Of course he has. You saw it? He asks. You nod. He says nothing else. Just sits beside you on the stone bench in the garden, and together you watch the koi drift in lazy spirals, as if nothing above them is changing. The silence between you is not hostile. It's simply aware. Historians still argue, Lynn says softly, whether the twin lights of the Shu dynasty signaled heaven's wrath or heaven's renewal. You nod. And whether they ever existed at all. Lynn nods. That too. Then he asks, will you tell the emperor? You answer, I don't have to. And you don't, because by that evening, a white-robed eunuch appears bearing a summons. Not just to you, but to Lynn as well. The emperor wishes to speak. Not to hear, not to receive a report. To speak. Which means he already knows something, or everything, and wants to see what you do when he says it out loud. So you dress carefully. You take your time, and you remind yourself, as you adjust the folds of your robe and brush a speck of ash from your sleeve, that the sky may be unpredictable. But the court is worse. One flickers, the other burns. And here you are, walking between them both. The hallway that leads to the Imperial audience chamber is a long one, longer than it needs to be. As if designed by an architect who believed intimidation was best achieved by echoing footsteps and ceilings too high to reach with certainty. The kind of corridor that makes even the most confident of men begin to question whether their robes are sitting right, whether their shoes make too much noise, whether they should have studied the constellations one more time just in case they were being summoned, not for consultation, but for correction, or worse, for demonstration. For there have been astrologers in dynasties past who were promoted in the morning and mysteriously vanished by nightfall. Not because they were wrong, but because they were too right at the wrong time. You and Lynn walk in silence, though not the companionable kind, more the kind that settles between people who have read the same poem too many times and suspect that they may be about to become footnotes in a version written by someone else. The eunuch escorting you has the gait of a man who no longer registers fear as an emotion, but more as a scheduling inconvenience. He walks precisely 3 steps ahead, not looking back once, and you briefly wonder if he has been instructed to keep walking, no matter what sounds might occur behind him. The chamber doors open not with a creak, but a whisper, a hiss of polished wood gliding over stone, and you are reminded instantly that this is not a place of comfort. It is a place of symmetry, of control, of silk banners positioned with a kind of precision only possible when arranged by men who believe heaven itself is observing the folds. The emperor is already seated. He does not rise. He does not smile. But he does look directly at you. And somehow that is worse. You bow. Lin bows. The eunuch bows so low, he seems to briefly vanish into the floor. The silence that follows is heavy, not awkward, but orchestrated, as if designed to make you wonder whether the emperor is measuring your heartbeat against the rhythm of the stars. Then he speaks. I'm told, he says, that there is a visitor. It is not a question. It is a declaration dressed as curiosity. You nod, keeping your voice soft. Yes, Your Majesty? A heavenly guest, present for several nights now. Moving eastward with deliberation, he tilts his head. And I am told there is another? Here you pause, but not long enough to suggest hesitation. There appears to be a second point of light, you reply. Dimmer, redder, perhaps slower, but present. The emperor's expression does not change, though you notice a muscle shift near his left eye, like a passing shadow across a marble statue. I see, he says. More silence. Then, the last time this court acknowledged 2 guest stars, he continues, almost idly. A governor poisoned his wife, a river flooded its banks, and a child in the northern provinces claimed to remember being a fox. My grandfather declared it an era of transition. Others called it nonsense. I do not yet know which I believe. You nod again. The stars do not compel majesty. They only suggest. He smiles, but only barely. And what do they suggest now? You glance once at Lin, who gives you the faintest shrug of helpless encouragement, as though to say, you're the poet here. So you say, they suggest that something is watching and waiting, that heaven, perhaps, has leaned a little closer. A longer pause this time. Then almost lightly, would you like to know what I dreamed last night? You hesitate, but only a moment before answering, if it pleases your majesty. I dreamed, he says, voice softening, that I was standing on a bridge that had no railings, no ropes, only mist below and mist above. And the bridge led into the mouth of a dragon made of smoke. I kept walking. I could not stop, but the smoke did not consume me. It only whispered. He looks at you. It said, look again. You do not move. You do not breathe. Because this is no ordinary dream. Not when recounted here. Not when the emperor is watching for your reaction, like a hawk watches a fish that doesn't know it's being watched. You choose your words carefully. Perhaps, you say, the dream suggests that what we see now is not all there is, that the truth waits beyond what we can name. He nods slowly, as if satisfied, not by the meaning, but by your willingness to avoid a direct answer. Very well, he says, then we shall wait. And we shall name it when it reveals itself. Then, with a slight flick of his fingers, you are dismissed. The audience is over. But the consequences, as always, are just beginning. Outside the chamber, Lin lets out a breath he seems to have held since last autumn, and mutters, I like that bridge. Very dramatic. You say nothing, because even now your mind is spinning, not with fear, but with the weight of what has just been transferred to you. The responsibility not only to watch, but to interpret carefully, to steer meaning without letting it run aground. Because in the court of the Son of Heaven, even a pause can become prophecy, and the echo of your voice might shape next season's harvest rituals or executions. Back at the observatory, the sky is no different than it was before. 2 lights, one bright, one faint, both indifferent. But now, when you look at them, you see not just stars, but reflections of a mind trying to read the world through dreams and symbols. Jun joins you carrying tea this time, which is either a sign of affection or an apology for making you go alone. You accept it. He asks, "Do you think the Emperor believes in omens?" You answer, "I think he believes in interpretation." "Same thing," Jun says, sipping. You watch the sky. The red light flickers, and for the first time you wonder, not what it is, but why it came. And whether it's alone, because that's the thing about omens. They rarely travel by themselves. They come in pairs, in patterns, in stories that unfold not all at once, but in pieces, like starlight, delayed across centuries, so that by the time it reaches you, what you're really seeing is history pretending to be present. You take a long breath, you pick up your brush, and you begin to write, not just a report, but a chronicle, because now you are no longer just observing the stars. You are being observed in return. By the 13th night, the second star has grown bolder, not in brilliance, for it remains modest in brightness compared to its companion, but in presence, in the way it now moves with a steadier rhythm across the sky, no longer flickering like an afterthought or a celestial stutter, but instead tracing its own deliberate path, as if it has realized you're watching and has decided it may as well perform. You, of course, continue to document its behavior with the care of a scribe writing holy verses. Your brushstrokes are firm yet gentle, your ink replenished more often than your tea, and your scrolls are beginning to accumulate like layers of time piled at the feet of your wooden desk, curling slightly at the edges, as though the pages themselves are stretching to catch a glimpse of the night sky above. Jun has taken to calling the stars the dancers, which, while not technically appropriate from an astronomical standpoint, feels fitting when you consider how they seem to orbit one another. Not literally, no, but narratively, mythically, in a way that invites speculation and metaphor. The kind of poetic movement that makes palace poets giddy and war ministers anxious. In fact, one such minister, Lord Shen, whose fondness for calligraphy is second only to his paranoia, sends a request via courier for a private consultation. And you, being both a court servant and someone mildly curious about what a man who owns 47 swords wants with a telescope operator, agree. The meeting takes place in the inner gardens, a location chosen, you suspect, not for its peace, but for its acoustics, for the way its tall bamboo muffles voices and echoes footsteps. Lord Shen arrives in full robes, which you interpret either as excessive formality or refusal to be caught unprepared. And the conversation begins with small talk about seasonal rains before veering, predictably, into the realm of celestial omens. He clears his throat dramatically. "This second light," he says, "have you considered its proximity to the constellation of the vermilion bird?" You nod. It passes near it, yes, though not within the boundary of its heart. He mutters, stroking a beard that looks freshly oiled. Still near enough for some to suggest a martial interpretation. You remain silent, because that's the dance. You don't confirm. You don't deny. You let others draw lines between stars and swords. But Lord Shen is not satisfied with silence. He leans forward, voice dropping low. I need to know, he says. Is this a sign of war? Of rebellion? You consider your answer carefully, letting the breeze rustle the hem of your sleeves while your mind flickers across everything you've read, everything you've seen, and more importantly, everything that could be mistaken for prophecy if delivered in the wrong tone. Finally, you say, the stars speak in possibility, not decree. They do not promise, but they warn. What matters is not what they show, but how men choose to read them. He scowls unsatisfied, but he says nothing more, which tells you everything, because fear seeks confirmation. And the absence of it breeds more stories than any ink on parchment ever could. After he leaves, you linger a while, walking through the garden's winding paths, letting your mind stretch beyond the palace walls, beyond the confines of protocol and the constant weighing of each sentence, each metaphor, each subtle shift in phrasing. You think of the first time you ever looked through a tube of brass at the sky, not as a court observer, but as a boy, holding your father's hand, squinting into the heavens and seeing not policy or politics, but endlessness. Back then, the stars were just stars. They didn't ask you for meaning. They didn't burden you with consequence. Now they feel like letters in a language everyone wants you to translate, but no one wants to learn. Historians still argue whether the astrologers of the Tang dynasty truly influenced imperial decision-making or merely reflected it, like mirrors held up to the throne. But you suspect the truth is messier, that emperors have always needed astrologers, not to predict events, but to justify them, to wrap decisions in divine context, and send them forth cloaked in the silk of celestial inevitability. And perhaps, if you're honest, there's comfort in that, because if the stars declare something, then no one must bear the blame. That night, you return to your observatory and find a small scroll left on your table. No signature, no seal, just a single line written in neat, practiced strokes. Look not only at the sky, but also at the water. John, predictably, believes it's romantic. Maybe you have a secret admirer, he says, and you reply, if they admire me, they could start by not being cryptic. But something about the message sticks with you. Look at the water. It's not a reference you recall from the standard star manuals or any of the 1,000 scrolls you've read by lantern light. But it reminds you, subtly, quietly, that reflections are sometimes more revealing than the thing being reflected. So before dawn, you climb to the northern edge of the compound, where the old lotus pond sleeps beneath the stone terraces, its surface still and undisturbed, save for the occasional ripple of a frog's lazy movement or the brief tremble of a dragonfly tracing its circles above. You kneel by the edge, peer down, and there they are, the stars, doubled, shimmering, not in orderly paths, but in liquid suggestion, their forms distorted by wind and light, by leaf and sky. And in that wavering reflection, you see something strange. A third light. Not in the sky above, only in the water. Faint, greenish. Blurred like a thought you almost grasp, but can't quite hold. You look up. Nothing. Only the two stars. Still dancing. Still indifferent. But in the water, still. That pale ghost of a third light remains. You stay there until morning, unmoving, watching until the sun rises and the pond becomes a mirror, too bright to bear. Back in the observatory, you check your charts again. You search the heavens with every instrument you possess. But nothing shows. No third light, nothing green, nothing new. Which means either your eyes have lied to you, or something is hiding where only reflection can catch it. And that somehow feels worse. You do not report it. Not yet. Instead, you record the sighting in your private journal, the one you never show anyone, not even John. You draw the pond, the stars, the pale green glow. You label it, possibly imagination, possibly omen, possibly neither. And you leave it at that, because some things must not be interpreted until they're ready. Some things need time. And the sky, unlike men, is never in a hurry. It's in the long pause between duties. Those narrow hours when the moon sits high, but the air refuses to stir. When even the insects seem to rest their wings. That you find yourself returning to the pond again, barefoot this time, robes trailing in dust. Because something about the quiet has changed since that greenish glimmer first blinked at you from the water's skin. And though you know better than to chase shadows, there's a part of you, that same part that once believed stars were gods and frogs were sages, that insists something waits to be understood. If only you look with the kind of patience that cannot be taught, only remembered. Tonight, the surface of the pond is glassy, but not still. Ripples form with no visible cause. No frog leaping, no branch falling, just a slow pulsing like the breath of something beneath. And though reason tells you it is nothing more than wind, perhaps underground springs, perhaps a passing draft, your instincts, older, less polite, insist otherwise, whispering, maybe, just maybe. The heavens are not the only ones watching. You kneel again, letting your fingers hover above the water, without touching, afraid to break the illusion and wait. Eyes soft, not searching, just receiving. Eventually, the reflection of the sky forms as expected. The twin stars, the familiar arrangements of constellations you've traced 1,000 times, with both ink and thought. But again, there it is. Faint, flickering near the edge. That subtle jade light. Not green like moss or emerald, but green like something otherworldly. A color that doesn't quite belong in the palette of night. Something that seems not to emit light, but to pulse suggestion. You blink. It remains, and this time it moves, just a twitch. A drifting shimmer across the mirrored surface, like a fish darting just below the calm, or a thought you can almost remember. You glance up. Again, nothing. Just the night sky, plain and unchanged. Stars where they should be. Darkness filling the gaps like ink fills the grooves of a brush stroke, too deep to erase. The reflection is lying to you, or the sky is, and you're not sure which is worse. You return to your quarters with a furrowed brow. And Jun, half asleep, on a cushion shaped like a turtle, looks up with one bleary eye and says, "Don't tell me you saw another one," before yawning theatrically and mumbling something about dream stars being easier to catalogue because they obey your rules instead of their own. You say nothing. Instead, you light a single taper, open the scroll you began the previous week, and start a new line beneath your notes. Reflections as alternate observatories. Phenomenon recurring. You write slowly, thoughtfully, not out of laziness, but out of caution, as if the very act of naming what you saw could make it more real, could pull it from the water's boundary into the emperor's sky. And you're not yet ready to explain how a third star only appears to those who refuse to look directly. Historians still argue whether the Imperial Astrologers of later dynasties truly believed in omens or merely pretended to. But for you, the line between belief and utility has long since blurred. And what matters now is not whether a phenomenon is provable, but whether it can be used, whether it enters the web of power and story and silk, because even the strangest flicker in the sky can become a reason for reform or punishment or a new holiday if spun with the right kind of ink. The next day, a visitor arrives from the southern provinces, dressed in heavy silk far too elaborate for summer, announcing himself not as a scholar, but as a sky scribe, a title that does not exist officially, but carries the tone of someone who has come to say something inconvenient. You host him in the side chamber, where the air moves just enough to keep flies at bay, but not enough to be called breeze. And after the usual pleasantries about rice harvests and eclipse predictions, he leans forward and says, quite casually, "Have you seen it too?" You pretend not to understand. He clarifies, "The third light in the water, it follows the second star." And now, suddenly, the silence is heavy in a new way. Not suspicious, but sacred. Like the pause between the end of one poem and the beginning of another, when no one breathes, because to do so would break the spell. "How do you know about it?" you ask finally. "I didn't," he replies, "until it appeared in our reflection pool 3 nights ago." Now the local magistrate won't stop asking if it's the spirit of a drowned noble. You both chuckle, but there's a tightness to it, a shared discomfort in realizing that what you saw alone might not be so alone after all. He produces a folded parchment, unrolls it carefully, and reveals a painted chart. Rough, imprecise, but unmistakable in its attempt to depict the position of the 2 known stars, and a third, green-tinted one, hovering below them, just off-center, just askew enough to feel wrong. "Others are seeing it too," he says. "Not in the sky. Only where water touches moonlight." You stare at the drawing, and your fingers twitch with the need to copy it, to preserve it in your own archive. But instead you nod, thank him politely, and say you'll investigate further, though both of you know that this is not an investigation anymore. This is a confirmation. That night, you dream of ripples that hum in voices you can't quite place, of stars that fall upward, of eyes beneath the surface, blinking in slow synchrony with the constellations you've mapped since childhood. When you wake, there is ink on your fingertips, but you did not write anything. Or at least, you don't remember doing so. John finds you staring at your own palm over breakfast, and in typical June fashion, simply says, "You look like someone who met a ghost and forgot to bow." You smile tiredly and return to the pond, because now the water isn't just reflecting, it's anticipating. Each night that follows, the green glimmer appears sooner, moves more visibly, begins to draw patterns of its own. Tiny arcs and spirals that seem deliberate, like brushstrokes written underwater, as if something beneath is trying to write back. You begin recording these motions, not on public scrolls, but in a small journal made from mulberry paper, stitched at the edges and sealed with wax when not in use, because this is no longer court business. This is personal. This is something unfolding outside the chain of command, outside the empire's grand machine of meaning, something that has not yet passed through the emperor's gaze and therefore remains untouched, unclaimed, yours. John watches all of this with mild concern, but says little, save for the occasional remark like, "If it starts spelling words, please don't read them aloud." Or, "Should we start offering it tea?" You don't laugh as much as you used to, not because you're afraid, but because you're starting to wonder if the stars themselves are changing, not in their positions or colors, but in their behavior, their attitude, as if the appearance of the third reflection has disrupted a balance you never knew existed. And now the sky, once a patient and impassive companion, has become curious, reactive, even playful. And deep down, a question begins to grow. Not, what is the third light, but who sent it? It begins with a silence that doesn't belong, the kind that arrives not because there is nothing to hear, but because everything that should be sounding has, quite suddenly, forgotten how to make noise. No cicadas, no breeze teasing the leaves, no distant yawning from the night guards, who usually mutter poetry in half sleep at the back wall of the compound. It's the sort of absence that presses against your ears until you hear your own breath too clearly, the subtle rustle of your robe too loudly, the small creak of your knee as you crouch again by the pond. Because of course you're here again, drawn by that maddening rhythm the green reflection has taken on, a loop of sways and flickers that seem increasingly like a language. One without grammar, perhaps, or at least one whose syntax operates in an entirely different logic, where proximity and pulse are more meaningful than syllables or shape. You've stopped trying to describe it in the formal logbooks, the ones the emperor's archivists occasionally request and pretend to read, because those scrolls are for facts. And what you've been witnessing lately lives in the spaces between them, like the breath between verses, or the pause between a bell's ring and its echo. Instead, your notes have become metaphors, sketches, half-poems, written in the margins of discarded star maps. A looping line might be labeled a question, while a wobbly streak might simply read, "No." You're no longer charting stars. You're translating a dance performed only in water, visible only in moonlight, meaningful only to someone who's learned how to wait. Historians still argue whether the Imperial Astrologers of the Tang courts ever encountered phenomena they kept secret, not out of political fear, but because the observations were simply too strange to be believed. But you now understand how easy it is to keep a secret when the only witness is reflection, when the only proof disappears the moment the water is touched. You haven't told Jun everything. Not yet. Partly because you worry he'll laugh and then believe, and partly because part of you doesn't want this mystery solved. Not yet. Because once something is explained, it stops being yours. It becomes a report, a weapon, a festival. Tonight, however, something shifts. The light in the water, once content to drift and shimmer along predictable arcs, begins to draw itself together, coalescing not in brightness, but in shape. A slow tightening like the gathering of silk threads on a loom, forming a circle. Not quite a perfect one, more like the impression a wet brush leaves on parchment. Slightly uneven, slightly blurred, but unmistakably intentional. And within that circle, nothing. Not darkness, not light, just a stillness so precise it unnerves you. Because even reflections, like stars, are supposed to move, supposed to ripple with the world's breadth. But this does not. This center holds, and you realize it's not a shape at all. It's an eye, or something like one, and you don't know how long you kneel there, staring into that gentle, silent void. But at some point, you hear Jun call your name, voice hesitant, like someone afraid they're waking you from a dream that might be important. When you turn to him, you half expect to find the world changed, but everything looks the same. The pond, the stars, the edge of the terrace, the gentle rise of the moon over the west wall. Only the eye is gone, or hiding. Jun looks at you for a long time, not speaking. Then, "You're not sleeping much." You nod. "You know," but you don't explain. Instead, you say, "Can I show you something?" And he follows quietly. Together you sit by the water. He sees the green flicker. He's seen it before, but tonight it's gentler, almost playful. A small loop forming near the lily pads, like a shy greeting. You don't mention the eye. Not yet. Instead you ask, "What do you think it wants?" Jun doesn't hesitate. To be seen. That answer lingers in the air. Simple and profound. And you wonder how long you've been assuming that this was about messages, signs, portents. But maybe, just maybe, it's something lonelier than that. Maybe it isn't trying to tell you anything. Maybe it just wants you to look, to notice. Jun leans back and, for once, doesn't make a joke, just whispers, "If we tell the palace, they'll send priests or soldiers." You nod again. And so you decide, silently, together. You won't. Not yet. Because this isn't for them. This isn't about gods or omens or the emperor's need to conquer meaning. This is about wonder. And wonder doesn't survive translation. The next few nights you bring gifts. Not offerings exactly. There's no altar, no incense. But tokens, small gestures of attention. A scrap of embroidered silk you once found tucked in an old stargazer's journal. A tiny bell that no longer rings, dulled by time and rust. A feather from a night heron, sleek and obsidian, found near the canal after a storm. You place these by the edge of the pond, not expecting a response, just participating. And each time, the reflection grows clearer, more confident. No new eyes, no words, just steadier patterns. Circles that drift into spirals. Spirals that slow and pause before fading. And on the sixth night, something changes in the sky. The second star, the one that began this whole strange sequence, is dimmer, just slightly, but enough for you to notice. You log it carefully in the official scrolls. You make no mention of water or green or eyes, just star 2. Apparent magnitude variance 0.3. Further observation recommended. John reads over your shoulder and mutters, understatement of the century. You smile, but it's tight, because if the sky is changing, then you might be too late. Because if the second star disappears, you might lose the third as well. The water light, the pond mirror, the only thing that's felt like a conversation in months. And you begin to wonder, not fearfully, not yet, but curiously, what would happen if it did vanish? Would you forget? Would the world tilt back to ordinary? Would the green light ever return? The last entry in your private journal that week is just 3 words. Don't let go. You don't know who you're saying it to. Yourself, the light, the stars. But it feels necessary. It feels right. Because you're starting to think you want the first to see it, and you won't be the last. But you might be the only one who chooses not to name it. You begin to notice, as the nights stretch and summer slips into its last, lazier phase, that your relationship with the sky has subtly, almost imperceptibly changed. Not in the way a poet speaks of longing or loneliness, but in the quiet shifting of attention, as though the stars you once catalogued with reverence and discipline are now watching you back. It's not paranoia, and it's not fantasy, at least not the dangerous kind. It's more like the hush that settles between 2 old friends, and they both know something has passed between them. Unsaid, unnamed, but shared. You still perform your duties, recording transits, tracking the planet's crawl across the constellations, and preparing the weekly star memoranda for the court astrologer, who likes to pretend he understands them. But your heart, your gaze, and most damning of all, your curiosity, have become anchored to the reflection, not the source. The sky is becoming a backdrop, a prologue. The pond has become the page. Tonight you arrive earlier than usual, hours before moonrise, while the surface of the water still holds the last amber traces of dusk. And you wonder, perhaps for the first time, not what the light is trying to say, but who it believes you are. Because if it has been trying to communicate all this time, it must assume you're capable of receiving. And if it hasn't abandoned you yet, maybe it believes you're still worthy of the message, whatever form that message takes. Pulse, swirl, hush, pause. You sit cross-legged, fingers on your knees, spine bent just enough to relax but not to slouch. Like the old calligraphy masters who claimed the soul of each stroke lived in the bones, not the ink. You breathe, you wait, you watch, and something different happens. The green glow appears, but it does not flicker or dance. It pulses once, strong and steady like a heartbeat, then vanishes. Then again, pulse, pause, pulse, pause. You find yourself counting the intervals. 1, 2, 3. Pulse. It's not chaotic, it's not drifting like a lazy fish beneath the surface. It's regular. You blink slowly, a long, slow blink, like someone watching snowfall in a dream, and realize with a thrum of quiet awe, it's signaling, not just shimmering, not just gesturing, signaling. You rush back to your study, not running, because that would break the moment, but walking with the kind of urgency that pretends to be calm. And you unroll your old cipher scrolls, the ones the court abandoned years ago, when they realized the emperor didn't actually care about encoded correspondence unless it involved plots against him. You flip through lines of ancient symbols and forgotten codes, none of which quite match what you saw, but some of which give you hope. John appears behind you, as always, uninvited, and somehow already chewing on a dried plum. Did it tap out a haiku? He asks. You don't even glance up. It repeated 4 times. Everything repeats, John says, but his tone is softer this time, almost reverent. That's the point of the sky, isn't it? You want to argue, but he's not wrong. Still, this repetition feels intentional. Not cosmic pattern, not divine rhythm. Deliberate. You try to draw it. Just a sequence of dots and dashes on a scrap of parchment. But the moment you put ink to page, the memory slips. The rhythm blurs. You can recall the shape of it, but not the tempo. As though the signal exists only at the moment of watching. As though the water itself is the only true medium. Historians still argue whether Tang-era sky records included allegorical phenomena meant more for poetic interpretation than scientific record. But you suspect that even if they didn't, even if they were completely earnest in every log, there must have been nights like this. Quiet, suspended, dripping with mystery, when the lines between observation and imagination tangled into a single thread. The next night, it changes again. The light comes earlier, and this time it's accompanied by sound, not a voice. Don't be ridiculous. It's not a voice, but a frequency, a hum, low, like the resonance of a bronze bell, not struck, but remembered. At first you think it's your ears playing tricks, that perhaps the stillness of your watch has made your mind fill in gaps with longing. But Jun hears it too, eyes wide, eyebrows raised, that rare expression he reserves for the truly unsettling. When something passes the threshold from amusing to sacred. It's music, he says, though it's not. Not exactly, but it's tonal, layered, deep. You record it, not with instruments, because you have none suited to the task, but with breath. You hum it back again and again until you're certain you've trapped the shape of it in your chest. Like a bird learning a song it was never meant to sing. And when the light pulses, it matches the hum. You feel it in your ribs, in your teeth. It isn't a coincidence. It's a duet. Jun bows, unprompted, and says softly, "If this is a god, it's the quiet kind." You nod because you're not sure what else it could be. But then you ask, what if it's not a god? Jun tilts his head. Then we're lucky it noticed us anyway. That sentence lodges in your thoughts long after he's gone to sleep, wrapped in his turtle-shaped blanket, and dreaming, probably, of celestial turtles that rule over rice harvests. You stay by the pond until the sky grays at the edges, until the stars dissolve, and the green light, as always, gives one last flicker, like a bow, like a curtain closing, and disappears beneath the still surface, which now seems less like water and more like memory, half liquid, half thought. You don't want to name it. Not yet. not until you're sure. But in your heart, a phrase begins to form. Not a name, not quite. Just an understanding. The one who hums. You write it in your private scroll. In small brush strokes, careful and deliberate. Not to claim it, just to remember. And that night, you dream again. But it's not the eye this time. It's the sound. The hum follows you through corridors of starlight, across rooms with ceilings made of ink, past windows that open into nothingness. And at the center, you see yourself. Not older, not younger, just watching the water, watching the light. You wake with your palm pressed against your chest, as though trying to hold the tone inside you a little longer. And for the first time, you wonder if this whole thing, this signal, this glow, this strange, tender communication, isn't coming from the stars at all, but from the earth, from below, from something deep and ancient and kind. There comes a point, sometime near the tail end of the 7th lunar cycle since the first flicker, when you no longer wonder whether this is real, and begin instead to wonder why it chose you, or, more precisely, why you're still here, being chosen again and again, every evening, by a thing that never speaks, never shows a face, and yet always arrives, as if summoned not by incense or incantation, but simply by the act of waiting. You sit longer each night, even on evenings when the court demands your attention, even when John warns that you're drifting through daylight like a man wrapped in mist. You still find yourself slipping away from the stone walkways and the brass astrolabes, past the scribes, past the halls, past the weight of human conversation, until at last you're alone again beside that same oval pond, which by now feels less like a part of the palace and more like a mouth to some older world, an opening stitched shut with lotus stems and moonlight. The green is waiting for you tonight. Not teasing, not slow to bloom, just there as though it had been watching your approach and decided not to waste time with ceremony. The pulses come faster now, but more organized, less chaotic. You don't try to transcribe them anymore. Instead, you've begun answering. Not with sound, not with writing, but with breath. You breathe in rhythm with the pulses. You match the silences with your own silences. It's absurd, of course, this silent mimicry, but it feels right, like tuning an invisible string, and with each exhale, the water grows calmer, the patterns more intricate, and the hum, when it returns, resonates, not in the air, but in your bones, as though your very marrow has been taught the melody of something older than light. Jun has stopped asking questions. He just joins you when he wants, sits close, but not too close, always careful not to cast a shadow across the pond. And when he does speak, it's in the voice of someone who already knows the answer won't come in words. You think it's lonely? He asks once without looking at you. You don't respond immediately. Then eventually you say, maybe not anymore. It's not that you believe the pond thing or the sky thing or whatever it is possesses emotion in the way humans do. It doesn't laugh, it doesn't mourn, but it does reach. And anything that reaches must, on some level, crave connection, even if only in the way vines seek walls or flames seek wind. One night, the color changes. It's not dramatic. No thunder, no crashing. But the hue shifts from green to a pale, opalescent blue. like starlight diffused through ice. It takes you a long moment to realize what's different, because the motion remains familiar, the pulsing rhythm intact. But when you breathe with it, the effect is colder, deeper, less like the song of a bird and more like the breathing of the sea. Chun notices it too, says simply, "It feels further away tonight." You nod and your heart sinks just slightly, because deep down you understand it's preparing to leave. You spend the next few days in a fog. You fulfill your duties. You note the shifting positions of Jupiter and Mars. You respond politely to the eunuch's questions about the coming eclipse. You even manage a half smile when the junior astrologer gets tangled in his own silk robe and crashes into a desk of scrolls. But your attention is elsewhere. It's with the blue, with the distance, with the impending silence that's creeping into your evenings. Historians still argue whether Tang astrologers believed in cyclical, celestial intelligences, entities that would arrive, share a season, then retreat beneath the veil of sky. But to you, it doesn't matter what the ancient records claim. You know what you've seen, what you've shared, and now you know it's ending. The following night, you arrive early, hours before moonrise. You clean the area around the pond. You light a lantern, but set it far enough away so as not to disturb the surface. And then you sit. Not to wait, just to be present. The blue comes, soft, gentle, and this time it moves differently. Not in pulses, but in spirals. Wide, slow arcs that fold inward, like a spiral galaxy turning in slow motion beneath the water's skin. You don't breathe, not out of fear, but reverence. You recognize this for what it is. Not departure, exactly, but closure. A final stanza, a farewell that isn't a goodbye, but a release. You lean forward slightly, placing your palm just above the surface, not touching, never touching. And you mouth, more than speak, the words, "Thank you." And the blue glows, not brighter, just fuller, like a nod. And then slowly, the spirals loosen, stretch, and dissolve into stillness. The hum fades, and the pond becomes a pond again. Quiet, unassuming. Just water. John finds you there, later, still sitting. He crouches beside you, pulls something from his sleeve. It's the feather you offered weeks ago, the obsidian heron quill. And he places it gently at the pond's edge. Neither of you speaks, because silence here is not absence, it's remembrance. You sleep that night, truly sleep. For the first time in months. No dreams, no hum, just rest. In the morning, you rise before the servants. You take your scrolls, the private ones, the ones no archivist will ever request, and you place them in a lacquered box. Not to hide them, not to discard them, but to protect them, the way one protects a letter from a friend who has moved away. And in your official duties, your observations return to normal. The stars do what they always do: move, drift, shine, lie. But now, when the Emperor asks if Mars will bring a year of trouble, or whether the fish-shaped comet signals rebellion, you answer with calm detachment, because you understand now that there are truths bigger than predictions, larger than omens, that not every light in the sky demands a verdict, that sometimes witnessing is enough. And on quiet nights, when the sky is clear and the frogs fall silent, and the world tips once again into stillness. You return to the pond, not hoping for the blue, or the green, or the hum, but simply to remember, to sit, to breathe, to say, I saw you. You existed, and that's enough. You start to notice, after a week or so of these blue silent nights, that the rest of the world has become louder, not in volume necessarily, but in insistence, as though the absence of the pond's nightly hum has cleared a space in your senses that every other sensation now rushes to fill. You hear the crickets again, individually now, not as a blended blanket of sound, but as separate chirps, spaced, unevenly, sometimes with tiny hiccups of rhythm that feel like the forest stuttering on purpose, just to keep you awake. You become hyper-aware of the pages in your scrolls, whispering to each other as you unroll them, of the purring rasp of ink against aged paper, of the way the candle wax drips with a little hiss each time it kisses the bronze rim of its dish. And instead of soothing you, these things cling to your mind like dew clings to the skin. Cool, inescapable, a little too present. It isn't that you miss the light. You do, but that's not all of it. It's that you miss what the light allowed. The slow, inevitable erosion of thought. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty but full. Full of suggestion, of invitation, of the sense that something was listening as much as it was being observed. In its absence, the sky feels indifferent again, which is not unusual for a sky. But after months of being gently acknowledged by something that pulsed in time with your breath, you find yourself longing not for spectacle, but for response. Jun, of course, has theories. It was a weather anomaly, he says one evening, biting into a plum with far more force than a fruit of that softness requires. Phosphorescent algae, or reflected lanterns from the monks across the lake. They don't use lanterns, you reply without looking up from your bowl. Well, maybe they started. You both know he doesn't believe it. Not really. But the jokes have grown more frequent now, more elaborate, as though by adorning the mystery in ridiculous outfits, he might somehow bring it closer again, or at least keep it from drifting completely into the realm of myth. Historians still argue whether Tang astronomers kept private records separate from the state archives. Journals of observation too speculative, too strange, or too sacred to share with the bureaucracy. And although no such scrolls have survived in the public domain, you're fairly certain that you now are among that hidden lineage. The quiet fringe dwellers of celestial record-keeping, the ones who noticed not just the planetary alignments, but the way the wind seemed to turn a page on its own the night Mercury disappeared behind the moon. Tonight, as you sit by the pond, with your empty scroll and your half-empty bowl of rice, you don't expect anything. That's important. Expectation ruins rhythm. And you've learned, through all these nights, that rhythm is sacred. But still, you sit. You sit because something in your bones demands the silence, demands the watching. You sit because sitting is now your liturgy, your devotion. And because even if the pond never glows again, its stillness has become your altar. The moon is low, barely more than a fingernail against the velvet black, and you can hear, just barely, the footsteps of a deer in the grove behind the stables. It's that quiet. Even the palace dogs have stopped barking. The entire compound feels like it's paused for breath. Then only then the surface shifts. It doesn't glow, not yet, but it trembles, just slightly. And from the far side of the pond, something rises. It's not a light, not a color, but a shape, vague, shadowed. Your body tenses, not out of fear, but caution. And for a wild second, you think it's a person. Some wandering monk or lost servant, risen from the water like a dream, with wet feet. But no, it's not rising from the pond. It's hovering. You blink, it vanishes. You don't gasp. You don't move. You simply stare at the space it was, trying to memorize the air it displaced, the echo it left. Jun, who has returned with another bowl of plums, freezes mid-step. You saw it, he whispers. You nod. He lowers himself next to you and places the fruit silently between you. No joke this time, no smirk. Just shared breath, shared night. I thought I dreamed it before. He says after a long while, weeks ago, a figure, not human, but shaped like one. I thought it was the rice wine. You don't answer. You both just look at the pond, which has returned to stillness. No ripples, no light, and you realize something that makes your stomach turn and settle at the same time. The signal hasn't stopped. It's changed, evolved. It's no longer the dance of photons on water. It's presence, arrival, watching. It never left. It just stopped needing the glow. The next morning, you rise with the sun, not because you're rested, but because rest has become a less relevant concept. And you begin redrawing your old maps, not of stars, but of the palace grounds, of the paths between observatory and pond, between study and orchard, marking times and temperature and wind direction. You map not the sky anymore, but the space where sky meets breath. Jun helps. He doesn't speak of it, but he helps. That afternoon, the court astrologer summons you. Apparently, the emperor's niece has had a dream involving a red carp and a collapsing pagoda. And it's fallen to you to determine whether this is an omen of war or merely indigestion. You smile politely. You scan the birth charts. You draw up a series of plausible interpretations, all of which you know the emperor won't read. And you return to your study, where the scrolls wait, whispering promises in their curls. The carp means nothing. Or maybe it means everything. But either way, you'll be back at the pond tonight, waiting. Not for answers, but for rhythm, because now you understand. This was never about astronomy, not even really about astrology. It was about attention, about how long you're willing to sit in silence and still believe something is listening. And when it finally answers, about having the humility to not interrupt. It's odd how quickly the extraordinary becomes routine, how a moment that once seized your breath with its impossible strangeness eventually slips into the texture of ordinary time. Like a thread in a familiar robe, no longer a disruption, but simply another stitch in the pattern of your evenings. You sit now not because you expect revelation or renewal, but because this is what you do. Because the act of being present in this place, beside the pond, beneath the ever-shifting sky, has become inseparable from your sense of self, as natural as chewing rice, as instinctive as breathing through your nose when the wind carries the scent of plum blossoms drifting over from the southern garden. The shape does not return, not as clearly as before, but the feeling lingers. Something like the memory of a voice, not quite audible, but still felt, as though the words once spoken have left their weight behind, pressing gently on the air, like fingers resting on the pulse of your wrist. The pond is still, but no longer empty. The space around it seems charged now, not in any theatrical or dramatic way, but with the kind of attentiveness you find in a room just after someone meaningful has departed, when the objects have not moved, but everything feels slightly different, as though the world is waiting for you to acknowledge that something sacred happened here. John doesn't speak of it anymore, not directly. Instead, he carves small wooden tokens in his spare time, delicate, abstract things that resemble stars, eyes, or spirals, and leaves them scattered around the pond's edge. Not like offerings, but more like footprints. Quiet reminders that someone was here, that someone noticed. You begin doing the same, though your tokens are less artistic. Little bundles of dried lotus petals wrapped in silk thread. A folded scrap of a moon chart you no longer need. A feather, always a feather. Historians still argue whether Imperial astrologers engaged in private spiritual practices outside the sanctioned rituals of the court. Whether they believed the stars not only dictated the affairs of men, but whispered truths that could never be captured in official records. And while no edict survives to confirm or deny it, there is a kind of logic to the silence, a recognition that the most profound observations rarely survive bureaucracy. You understand that now, more than ever. What you've seen can't be charted. What you've felt can't be measured. But it happened. And it's still happening. There's a new comet. It appears just after the third full moon of the year, low in the eastern sky, a thin white scar that seems to hover rather than move. The Emperor demands interpretations. The court erupts into speculation. Some say it foretells the rise of a rival dynasty. Others claim it marks a year of fire and flood. You're summoned to offer your reading. You lie, gently, respectfully. You say the comet is a symbol of renewal, a sign of the heavenly mandate reaffirming itself, a reassurance that the empire is stable, blessed, aligned with the heavens. You say this because it's what is expected, because the emperor needs peace more than truth, because sometimes a lie is the softest version of compassion. But in your private scrolls, you write something else. You write, "It is not alone," and that is the truth, or at least your version of it. Because when you looked at the comet, when you traced its trajectory with your bronze stylus and calculated its declination, you felt something shift, not in the sky, but in you. As though that thread of light had brushed your own thoughts on its way across the firmament. It is not alone, and neither are you. That night, the pond is silent. No ripples, no hum, but the air is full of tiny movements, leaf tips twitching without wind, frogs pausing mid-croak, the faintest tremor in your own breath. You kneel by the water, not to look, but to listen. And what you hear is this. Stillness does not mean absence. The quietest moments are often the ones that carry the most weight. You remember this now. You let it settle. John brings tea. He sits beside you, places the cup in your hand without speaking, and you drink it without breaking your gaze from the water. It's warm, earthy, slightly bitter, and for a brief second, you think you can taste starlight in it, which makes no sense. But you smile anyway. Tomorrow the Emperor will summon you again. There will be more questions, more charts, more interpretations dressed in careful language and bound in red thread. But tonight is not for them. Tonight is for remembering that the universe does not speak in answers. It speaks in presence, in alignment, in rhythm. You begin a new scroll, not one to be stored in the archives, not one to be read by ministers or passed to the future court. This one is for you, for John, for the pond, for the sky. You begin it with a single phrase. I saw the silence, and it saw me back. And then you draw a spiral. Not the kind you find on seashells or in turbulent weather maps, but the one you saw that night in the blue. The inward turning, ever-reaching shape that seemed to say, we are all moving toward each other. Slowly, quietly, even when we believe we are standing still. You draw it again, larger this time. Then you breathe. You set the scroll aside, and for the first time in months, you sleep there, beside the pond, without a lantern, without incense, without anything but your robes, and the sound of night folding itself around you like a blanket. And in the moment between wakefulness and dream, you feel it again. Not the light, not the hum, but the pulse. Just one. A single, gentle thrum in your chest, like a bell rung once in a distant temple. And you understand. It was never about deciphering the stars. It was about recognizing the beat within them and matching it. You wake before the sun, not because of some sudden noise or startling movement, but because something in the stillness shifts, as if the darkness itself exhales and withdraws gently from your skin. And you realize that sleep, for all its thickness, had never really taken you fully, only brushed over you like silk over polished stone, enough to loosen your thoughts, but not erase them, just as the stars fade, not by vanishing, but by being gradually overwhelmed by the slow, persistent bloom of light returning from behind the eastern hills. You stretch slowly, feeling the ground beneath your body, the dew that has crept through your robes, the small soreness at the base of your neck that tells you you've truly slept outside. No pillows, no palace comforts, only the earth, remembering that your body belongs to it. John is already awake, perched on a stone near the edge of the pond, still and quiet, so still that a dragonfly rests calmly on his sleeve, undisturbed. He doesn't turn as you rise, but he offers you the smallest of nods, the kind that says, yes, I felt it too. Whatever it was, or is, or will be. Because by now, you've both stopped trying to define the thing, whatever its name might have been in the ancient tongues, or which scroll it might have once graced with metaphor and ink. The water is mirror smooth again, but not empty. Never empty. Not since that first night months ago, when the blue light hummed into your chest, like the pulse of a second heart. And even now, without any shimmer or shape, the pond holds a tension, a readiness, the way a mouth pauses just before speaking, or a curtain quivers before being drawn back to reveal a stage. You no longer wait for the spectacle, though. The waiting itself has become the experience. The posture of readiness is now your ritual. Today will be the spring festival. Drums will sound in the inner court. The eunuchs will bustle around with armfuls of paper lanterns, and young girls from the southern provinces will perform dances that mimic the flowering of peonies, all silk and fingertip flourishes, and the emperor will sit under the shade of golden parasols, while the air is thick with the scent of roasted chestnuts and sweet rice balls, dyed pink with beetroot and stamped with phoenix cress. Everyone will be watching the skies tonight, not for omens, but for fireworks. Those brilliant explosions that have nothing to say, really, but still demand your attention like a spoiled child slamming a door to make sure you know they're there. You'll be there too, of course. You'll perform the blessing rites, read the ceremonial stars, wear your most formal robes with the silver-threaded cranes stitched into the sleeves. And when someone asks, because they always ask, you'll smile that tight-lipped smile and say, yes. It's a most auspicious alignment this year. Very promising, very harmonious. And they'll nod and return to their pastries and plum wine, satisfied. But none of that will be real, not for you. Because tonight, after the festivities, after the acrobats and the recitations and the firework dragon explodes in artificial thunder above the lotus pond, you will slip away quietly, robes loosened, hair no longer bound by pins, and return once more to this place, this silent circle of water, this mirror of thought. And you will kneel, not to pray or to record, but simply to be present. Because presence, you've come to learn, is its own kind of devotion, and perhaps the most honest one. Historians still argue whether the Imperial Astrologers believe themselves to be intermediaries, channels through which the heavens passed messages to the emperor and the people, or whether they were simply observers, trained interpreters who read the night like a librarian skims a catalogue. The truth, as always, lies in the grey space between. You were both. You are both. A mouthpiece, yes, but also an ear. A scribe of stars, but also a listener of silences. And now as you trace your fingers in slow circles on the surface of the pond, watching the ripples spread and fade, you feel the truth settle in your bones. Not a fact, not a revelation, but a rhythm, a pulse, like a memory of a heartbeat that might never have been yours, but feels like it always lived inside you. You think of your first years in the palace, the way you used to press your ear against the stone walls of the observatory at night, hoping to hear the stars moving. You think of how disappointed you were when all you heard was your own breath, amplified and distorted by stone and hope. But maybe that was always the message. The breath itself, the echo, the patience it takes to hear yourself in the silence. Jun stands and joins you, and neither of you speaks, because by now the language you share doesn't rely on words. He places something beside you, a small wooden carving of a star with 6 uneven points, and you nod in thanks, though he doesn't need it. It's not a gift. It's a marker, a punctuation in the sentence of your lives, placed gently at the end of a long, slow clause. You wonder, as the first rays of sunlight stretch across the surface of the pond, whether the thing that watched you all those nights still lingers. Not above, but around, maybe inside, and whether you've become its observer now, recording its silence the way it once recorded your breath. And for a moment, you think you see something in the water again. Not a glow, not a shape, but a suggestion, a shimmer, like the idea of a ripple rather than the ripple itself. And you don't move, you don't blink, because to acknowledge it too loudly might scare it away. You let it be. You let it happen. You let yourself be witnessed. And then, very slowly, you begin to write again. Not for the emperor, not for the court, not even for yourself, but for the rhythm, for the silence, for whatever it is that meets you in the stillness. And the words that come are simple. Still here, you write, still listening. And now, with your eyes heavy and your body softened by stillness, let the last traces of thought dissolve like morning mist over the quiet pond, that sacred silent surface where ripples once danced and then disappeared, without need for applause or answer. You've traveled far, not in distance, but in depth. And even if your feet never left the soft stones of the Imperial Garden, your breath has followed stars. Your mind has wandered between meanings. And your spirit, however quietly, has learned something new about patience, about presence, and about the weightless art of noticing what others ignore. You've sat beside the astrologer as he charted what could not be proven, waited through evenings of silence that said more than words, and stood in the hush before sunrise, when everything in the world pauses just for a moment, unsure whether to begin again. You've read omens, tasted the bitter tea of subtle truths, and folded yourself into rituals so ancient their origins have vanished like ink in rain. And yet, you carried on, not to uncover conclusions, but simply to be there, to witness. So now let your breath slow even further. Let the rhythm of your heart settle into the same tempo as the stars above, unhurried, ancient, and endlessly reliable. Feel your chest rise and fall, not as an effort, but as something that simply happens, the same way the sun knows how to return, the way a lotus opens without being taught. Let your jaw loosen. Let your fingers uncurl. Let the weight of the day drift down to your toes and slip through the floor like sand in an hourglass that no longer needs to count. You're not reading the stars now. You're part of them. And they, just like you, are very quiet tonight.